Okay, this is a topic I can't believe, honestly, that I haven't covered this in a webinar before, but this is probably one of the most important topics you could hear and watch. So I'm pretty excited about talking about this today. And I think this will help a lot of people. And this topic, I think a lot of reasons why it's important, but I speak to a lot of candidates in the course of my job that have lots of problems with second round interviews. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk a little bit about first round and what happens there. And then I'm going to talk about the stuff that goes wrong during second interviews. And honestly, wow, I've seen so many people not get jobs with second round interviews, meaning they get interviews with the first round, but when they go into the second round, they don't get interviews. And honestly, one of the most important things to understand is if a law firm is bringing you in for a second round interview, they're very much hoping they can hire you. They really do want to hire you. They have a need. You're spending a lot of time with their attorneys who aren't billing during that time. And if you can't get a job during a second round interview, you're probably doing some stuff wrong, because the first round, you're presentable enough, you seem like you have enough enthusiasm. So what's going wrong in these second round interviews that you're not getting the jobs? Now, there's just a couple small things that I want to cover with you just so you understand how important the second round interview is. So as a recruiter, when I would work with candidates directly and send them out on second round interviews, I typically would get somewhere between 70 and 80% of people would get offers after the second round interview. And that has to do with preparation and a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be covering today. Because people just do some of the same things wrong over and over again. Law students do stuff wrong, practicing attorneys do stuff wrong, partners do stuff wrong. And if you're making mistakes in your second round interview, then you really need to understand what they are. And you need to understand what different types of firms are looking for. And people make lots of mistakes during second round interviews, and they often don't know what they are. And they don't get job offers because of it. And the mistakes that you make as a lateral attorney are often much more serious than the things you make with the mistakes you may be making as a law student interviewing. The reason for that is law students are green. They may say things that are inappropriate and that are they just position themselves in different ways. And attorneys will realize that they're soon going to be indoctrinated in what a law firm is and what their expectations are when they get there. And so there's a little bit more leeway in second round interviews in law firms, but if you're a law student, but not so much with practicing attorneys. This is the kind of thing that attorneys will say to me. I always get past first round interviews with law firms, but after a second round interview, they never hire me. And they seem to like me after the first time they meet me, but not after. And so this is actually very common. It's if you're not getting jobs after second round interviews, it's very common. In fact, I've spoken to attorneys that have been on 25 plus second round interviews over the course of a year or a few years and still not gotten a single job offer. So you have to ask yourself, what are they doing differently in the second round interview than they may be doing in the first round interview? And those are some of the things that we're going to cover today. And obviously something's very wrong. If I'm able to get, when I prep people for interviews, 70+% of those people jobs, and people that are doing this stuff on their own aren't getting jobs, you really have to realize right away that you're doing some stuff that's wrong. You're saying stuff that's wrong, and you're not connecting in the proper way with the employer. Again, law firms are very careful about second round interviews. They want to bring in people that they believe they're going to hire. They don't want to feel disappointed, and they want to be able to make you an offer. They're really hoping that you do well. So I'm going to tell you about what these attorneys do wrong so you don't make the same mistakes. Some of what I say to you may be offensive because you may be coming at your career in a certain way, but you have to remember your only objective in a second round interview is to get a job. You have no other objective. You don't have to share anything. You don't have to do anything else but get the job. You need to make sure that you're not making certain mistakes. And if you do, you can fix them. So it's really not that uncommon for attorneys to some people to get second round interviews and always get offers. As a matter of fact, I've met some people that have been on every single interview they get, and they've ever gotten to the second round interview, they've gotten an offer. There's people that are very good at selling themselves, knowing what to say, being appropriate, and really convincing people to hire them. And I will talk about that today as well. And all they need, a lot of attorneys, is to get in the door. And once they're in the door, they seem to always get job offers. So seemingly no matter what. And every time I had a girl, this is funny, years ago, and she was in New York and was thinking about moving to Los Angeles. And so she would come out and interview with all these firms, and everybody would make an offer to her. And some of them were, I'm not trying to be rude, but they were much better firms than she should have gotten a job with. And everybody hired her. And then after she got hired, then she would grill the firms and ask them all sorts of questions and decide that she didn't want to work there. But certain people are very good and understand how to get jobs. And it doesn't matter, by the way, if you're personally extremely persuasive, if you're tall or short, or if you're a man or a woman or whatever your background, it doesn't matter who you are or what you think you are. It's the things that you do and say. And there's just certain things that certain attorneys know how to do and others do not. When an attorney is young, when you first come up and you're working in a law firm or whatever type of office, your government office as a summer, you're typically trained, and you're trained with a lot of input to your work product. You're criticized, you're shown how to shorten things and move things around, and laws you may have missed or arguments you may have missed. And it can be very humbling. The same thing would happen if you were to go and get input on your interview skills. And so if you're in law school, a lot of law schools do mock interviews, and that would be a good idea. And if you're not in law school, you should try to get other people that you may know that are attorneys to even do mock interviews with you. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know today, but sometimes being directly criticized and will help you learn and grow. And especially if you're someone that's going out on a lot of second interviews and not getting jobs. And again, we're going to talk a lot about that today. And it's not easy being rejected from firms. It's not easy not getting jobs after second offers. And this is all a lot of work. It's a lot of work whether you're using a recruiter or you're doing it on your own, when you have to apply to a bunch of places. And it can be upsetting when a lot of places you're applying don't interview you. And then it can be upsetting when, it's a lot of work to get ready for a first round interview. Then it's even more work to get ready for a second round interview. And then not getting the offer is really not what you want. So what you want is to be able to get the offer all the time. And because all of these steps that go into getting the job are very important. One of the things I just want to bring up real quickly is a lot of times people will get interviews with different firms, and then they'll get an interview and they'll decide that for whatever reason, they don't want to work there. It could be I heard something bad about them. It could be my friend worked there and she had to work a lot of hours. It could be I'm not sure about the pay. I'm not sure about this. And you cannot, your job is to get a job. Once you get a job, many times you can negotiate your salary, you can negotiate your hours, you can negotiate all sorts of things. But your job is to get a job. Your job is not to learn everything negative about someone that's potentially going to employ you before you go in, and then to reflect that in your question and enthusiasm. Your job is to go into a job and get it. That's your only objective, because having an offer is going to give you more confidence. Having an offer is going to give you the ability to negotiate the terms of your employment. Having an offer is going to enable you to potentially take that offer and maybe get other offers from similar firms saying, I've applied 2 weeks ago, I've gotten offers, but I really want to talk to you. There's all sorts of things you can do, but you need the offer. Don't make mistakes and not get the offer. And because you're going to be hurt. And sometimes people will do things intentionally. Sometimes, I don't even know that I should. Sometimes people do things like everyone has a thermostat, and your thermostat, you set it to the way you want things to be. So sometimes people will go into an interview with a firm that's much more prestigious than any place they've ever worked, but they can't possibly imagine those people would like them, and so they blow the second round interview because they don't have enough self-confidence, and because their thermostat's set down here, but really this firm will make them be at a higher level. There's just a lot of things that I want to share, but if people do go out in a lot of interviews and not get jobs, these are people from the best law firms in the world down to the smallest law firms. These are things that people do over and over again. And when you can't get a job, it can lead to all sorts of problems with your ego. With sometimes if you're expected to be working and you're suddenly at home all the time and not doing anything productive, it can lead to problems in your relationships. It leads to problems in terms of how other people see you if you're not getting jobs. It makes you less employable the longer this goes on. So you need to learn this stuff. This stuff is extremely important, especially if you're unemployed, or you think you're going to become unemployed. Extremely important. And I've seen people not being able to get jobs because they're not interviewing well. And then they take jobs way beneath them, meaning salaries that are 50% or more lower than they could make in the market if they interviewed well, or jobs in locations that they would never otherwise consider working in, or jobs in other practice settings because they believe that after some rejection, they're not employable. Your inability to do well in these second round interviews, or not to do the best you possibly can, is really something that's easily fixable if you know the rules. And that's what we're going to go over today. So I'm going to make some analogies here. I don't necessarily think this is the best analogy, but it may be. And you need to think of the interview process as almost dating. And so I'll just give you some examples here from my personal life. I don't know if it was 15 years ago or how long it was, but I remember starting the registration process on this website, match.com, and filled out a form with my age, location, and so forth in a moment of weakness. And I was single at the time, curious about what the site was about. Little did I know but that's why I did it. And so I never completely filled out the registration process. I never completed it, but it didn't really matter because Match.com immediately began sending me all these profiles of people at least once a day and trying to get me to sign up. And I'm sure that they were matching them to my location and all sorts of things. And one way to think about dating sites is similar to job sites, is similar to other things. The site had me basically tagged as an employer that was interested in hiring. Now, I'm not saying I'm hiring a significant other, but it's basically, that's what they're doing. They're sending opportunities. And the profiles I received were just like resumes. It's no different. It's pictures and interest and stuff. So it's not the same. If I saw something I liked, then I would obviously try to meet the person in some sort of informal setting, a coffee or something, for a screening interview. And if that went well, I'd try to have a real first date, dinner or something like that, which would be considered a second round interview. So your first meeting is artificial, meaning it's after seeing something or getting an alert about a job or a person, and you have a meeting. And if that goes well, which if you're just having coffee or something, you're not spending a lot of time, should and or can or may. But then you start meeting the person, everything goes into a little more depth. And then the idea is if your second round interview goes well, then something more formal can develop. So you might start seeing each other exclusively. So it's like the difference between a contract attorney and a permanent attorney or whatever. And then at that point, you would have a new girlfriend or boyfriend. And then at some point you might propose, and that would be a partnership. You can almost think of the first date as a screening interview. The second and third and fourth dates is follow-up second round interviews. Getting hired would be if you're an associate, would be the relationship developing, and if it goes well, then you become a partner. So the law of second round interview in the employment context is very similar to dating. The firm will have an opening. They'll send out information about themselves, links to their website, links to reviews, and they're basically advertising that they have an opening. And this is what we do with candidates. We send out information about the firm and rankings and pictures and whatever we possibly can to interest our candidates and people in the public about these openings. And if the law firm has an opening, then they're definitely looking to hire someone. And if someone comes along that's appropriate, they definitely want to do it. And again, law firms want all the people they interview to work out. And what that means is they're hoping that they do not have to waste a lot of time and effort of their attorneys and thousands of dollars and billable hours wasted if they hire by interviewing people that aren't going to work out. They want things to work out because it saves them time and eliminates the need for them to bring in more people and work's not getting done. So if a law firm has an opening, what that means is that there's work, it's not getting done, they're losing money. So they're losing money by not hiring people. And they really do want you to do well. This is what it's all about. I see firms sometimes when they call, even for a first interview, they are so enthusiastic and follow up so much that I know that they're going to make it work. Meaning, even if the person doesn't interview well, they're going to make it work. But most law firms aren't like that, but they really do want you to do well. They're not interested in lots of meetings and doing things. Some people may be interested in going out on 25 dates, but at some point, people get tired of that. And it's the same thing with law firms with positions. It takes a lot of work. It's time and energy. And the same thing when you meet a person on a dating site or whatever, you're really hoping that it's the right person so you can stop going out on all these first dates and then second dates and so forth. You want things to work out, and everybody does. If you just think back to people that you met in the future, you're really hoping it works out. It doesn't always, but you're hoping, or you may need to be convinced. If you meet someone or you go out on a date and that person shows up and they don't seem enthusiastic or they say a bunch of weird things, you're going to be disappointed because you know it's not going to work out. And that's too bad because you were excited to meet them. And this is what people do, especially on second dates. The second date is more like you get a little more depth about the person and things about them. And if they say too much or they tell you too many bad things, that can rub you the wrong way and screw everything up. And this is what people do in interviews. So let's talk about the first round interview. The initial decision to interview is usually quite simple. They see something new that they like, and it's based on your experience, your qualifications, or something else, and they bring you in. So if I know a law firm very well, I can take a look at a resume if they have an opening and know, just based on what's on the resume, if they're going to interview people. There's certain firms that won't interview people that have had more than 2 jobs in 10 years. There's certain firms that will only interview people from certain law schools, or certain firms that will only interview people locally. There's all these different kind of things that firms have. But if you get to the screening interview, guess what? You're qualified for the job. They don't really have any questions about that. You don't have to sell them on your experience. You have to sell them an enthusiasm for the job, but you don't have to sell them on your experience. Most of that stuff is really on your resume. People do stupid things all the time. They go into an interview and everything is on their resume, and they need to talk so much about their experience and go into all these things. No, the law firm knows that. There's something else going on in the interview. But the decision to bring you in for an interview is based on your resume, maybe based on having a really strong cover letter and your experience, your reputation, your connections, and other things that you may not have a lot of control over. One thing you do have a lot of control over is your resume. And that's important. I've done lots of resume workshops and webinars on resumes. I talk to people every day. The majority of attorneys that I talk to and that I review their resume, they're doing stuff wrong. If you're having a hard time getting first round interviews, it's your resume. It doesn't matter, by the way, when a law firm's looking at someone, if you're applying to the appropriate type firm, you need a firm that hires people with in your practice area and your education. What you're doing things in your resume are disqualifying for you. So this is not a webinar about how to do a good resume, but I really do recommend that you do the best possible job you can with your resume and your cover letter. And those are 2 things you have control. You have control of your resume if you're using a recruiter. You have control of your resume if you're applying to firms on your own, or however you're applying, you have control. Make sure your resume matches the job and that you look like a good fit for the job. And this is a big deal. You need to make sure your resume is definitely tailored to each position and looks like you're someone that is perfect for their practice areas. Applying for a job as an insurance defense attorney, not a good idea to list all these corporate transactions and things you may have done in addition to litigation or insurance defense. Applying for a job as a, corporate attorney, not a good idea to talk about litigation stuff. Your resume should be focused on whatever this job is, and that's what law firms are looking for. So in the online dating world, what are people looking for? Not much. They may look at your picture and see if you're someone that genetically or whatever they think looks interesting. They'll read a little bit about your background. If you say you're divorced 5 times, that may disqualify you. If you say some crazy things, that may disqualify you. If you write something that doesn't make a lot of sense, that may disqualify you. But they're really not, people aren't looking for a ton of information on dating sites. As long as you're consistent and nothing bad jumps out at people and people think you look interesting, then they'll decide it's worth having a meeting. And someone reading your profile may identify with the books you read, or I don't know what other kind of stuff people list on these sites. Your pets, your hair color, religion, all these are factors that people do. And it's no different than what's really going on what an employer is thinking about whether or not to bring you in. Now, I'm using dating sites and that sort of thing because I want you to really think of yourself as an employer, how the employer is reading your resume. The employer is reading your resume looking for certain things. just as if you're reading a dating site, you're looking for certain things when you look at people. It's simple as that. So you need to think about what's going to stick out to people. What do they want? And you may go and look at 200 people before you find someone that matches the kind of person you'd like to meet. And this is how it is with jobs as well. People inside of law firms may look at 200 applications that need to check certain boxes. It could be, again, working in the same city, having nothing but experience in that practice area, working with similar clients. You don't know what it is, just as you don't know what someone on a dating site is looking for when they're looking at your profile, but you know that there's things going on in the background. Some employers are very selective, some aren't, but most of the time people are going to speak with you when they see something they like and that they think is going to help them. And again, experience, education, where you last worked, maybe you're a college athlete and they like that, who knows? But the first round interview is very surface oriented. It's not getting into a lot of detail. You're showing your best face in your resume and your cover letter, just as you would on a dating site, and you're hoping that gets people's attention. First round interview, it's generally very quick. They don't want to spend a lot of time. They just want to see if you can look and act the part. You may speak with one person, 20 or 30 minutes. Sometimes law firms will just have you speak to someone in the recruiting department that will handle that. This is very common. Other times they may have you speak to a couple people for a very short meeting. They may do it in person or remotely, but sometimes you'll meet a partner in a coffee shop for coffee or something. That happens quite often, but it may be a phone call or a Skype or a Zoom meeting. And these are short and they're not going to go into a lot of detail. They're just basically sizing you up, see if you can conduct yourself, see if you seem likable and not likable, and see if you seem like someone that they would like to get to know a little bit more about and go deeper. And again, same thing with the first round interviews. Most of the time, these people really want to like you. They're very much hoping that you come in for a full round of interviews. A lot of firms, too, by the way, will just bring people in for a full round. They won't even bother with this because they'll see enough on the resume that makes in the cover letter and that it just makes sense for them to bring you in for a full round. But a lot of firms will do the first round just because it's a formality and it's expected and people have always done it. Our firms have always done it, but they're not eager to spend a lot of time interviewing a bunch of people in these short increments. They'd rather be billing hours to clients. They don't like to turn their attention away from work. So they're going to interview you, but they're not going to spend a lot of time. And this process is often much more of an annoyance for people. And they may not have any issues, hopefully don't have any issues with you. So the first round interviews, when they're done in person, the partners interviewing you are basically asking themselves whether they'd be comfortable working with you, whether you seem presentable, meaning some people come in and have nervous tics, they're biting their nails, they're checking their phone, they're saying weird things, making inappropriate jokes, and that can immediately disqualify you. And so you need to be careful about those sorts of things, and just in a first round interview, just be as professional as possible. You need to dress up. One of the things that's very funny is a lot of people will do remote interviews and sit there and be talking in their kitchen wearing a t-shirt or a shirt like I'm wearing. You want to dress up and look good. You need to take it seriously. If they see you're taking it seriously, then they're going to be more likely to bring you in. And law firms that are doing the first round interviews just need someone to do the work. And in order to succeed at that, you need to come in and give law firms the impression that you very much want the job, that you're grateful for the opportunity. You need to make the interviewer feel good about themselves and that you're enthusiastic, that you understand what the job is, and you really hope to speak to more people. And most attorneys, by the way, will do very well with that. It's much more common, meaning more than 50% of the attorneys that go out on these first round interviews, unless it's like a law school cattle call where they're interviewing 15 people over the course of 7 or 8 hours, that most of those people get callback interviews, and especially in the lateral stage. And most people understand the rules. It's just you have to talk the talk and you have to look like you want to work there. And that's about it. And this is not about, by the way, this presentation is not about the first round interviews, but I'm trying to give you a little background that we'll go into when we start talking about the second round. But you have to be deferential. You have to, and you have to make people like you and think that you want to work there and that it represents a good opportunity. And most people know how to do that. Most people go into first round interviews and get jobs. Now, there are a lot of people that go into first round interviews and treat them as second round interviews, meaning they start talking about things that they shouldn't, which are personal things, way too personal. They talk about being unhappy at their current employer. They talk about different things that you probably don't want to get into. Why is it inappropriate? Well, if you go out on a first date with someone and they're talking about how much they hate their last significant other, all these problems they're having, what mistakes that they made, I don't know. Your job is to put, you wouldn't like that person. So your job is to put your absolute best foot forward when you're going out on your first round interviews and do the best you can. It's no different than a coffee date. Two people meet. If they act, they seem like they like each other, they make a little chemistry or shared interest, then it may move to the next stage. And they're just trying to make sure that there's enough there to invest more time. And that's it. And many times there's not a connection. People walk into interviews all the time and they have a cold handshake, or they look down, they don't make eye contact, they start asking about salary and vacation and things, and that can be a real problem. You need to be ready for your first round interviews, and you need to think, again, like, how would I want to act if I was going out and meeting someone for a date, and how would I do that? And you need to make sure that you're doing a good job of that. In general, your first interview is very similar to just two people meeting and to see if there's any interest, and they want to make sure that what is represented matches what was there on the surface. And then again, if that stuff goes well, everything's going to move forward. So looking enthusiastic, looking like someone that would probably work a lot of hours, someone that's interested in improving, someone that understands the firm, someone that's more geared towards the job. Again, this is only about second round interviews, but I want to make sure that people understand that what you do well in first round interviews to get second round interviews really needs to carry over, because people make a lot of bad first round type interview mistakes prior to on second round interviews, meaning they'll walk in and they'll make assumptions that they might have the job and other things. So you don't want to come across as too confident, difficult to control. Nobody likes people that are arrogant and confident, too confident. Now, there's nothing wrong with being confident, but rub it in your face confidence is bad. Difficult to control means you're finding problems with your former employer, people you've worked with. You're angry. You may be too withdrawn. You may be critical of people, places, and things, meaning just real negative. You may come across as desperate, meaning people can sense that. You don't want to come across as desperate. You want to come across as someone who's very employable and will do well regardless of whether that employer has any interest in you. And they should pick up on that other people are going to hire them. You don't want to come across as annoyed or distracted or uninterested. And so these are all the same things that can damage your first coffee dates as well if you're meeting someone for dating. And so again, attorneys need to go in and not get hired and do what they need to do to get hired and not do these things in interviews. Now, back to these kind of things too. One thing that's also that you should be aware of is a lot of people may not want to work in a law firm anymore, or they may not want to practice law anymore. It may just be, and so you do these things intentionally. And whereas if you were interviewing to be a high school track coach, which you might really want to do, you would completely come across as easy, happy, enthusiastic. And so sometimes if you're doing these things, you really do need to make a little bit of an inventory. Is there something about practicing law that I don't like? So I just want you to really understand this, because this is a very important thing I'm telling you, right? Is there something about being an attorney that you don't like? Or is there something that's holding you back? Do you think it's going to be all unpleasant? Do you think you don't like it? You don't think you're not good enough at it? You don't like that? Who knows? But you cannot think that way going into these interviews. You have to be really on top of it. And you have to want to get hired, and you have to think positive thoughts about practicing law and positive thoughts about working with that employer. And you need to visualize like how great it would be. It doesn't mean you have to take a job if you get it, but you need to at least get the job. That's your job. Your job is to sell yourself. And frankly, this is so important because you're an attorney. And so this is one thing a lot of people don't understand. As an attorney, you're responsible for representing clients. And that could be a company trying to do something. It could be an individual trying to do something. It could be somebody who's in trouble. So you need to be able to get behind them and convince other people about things. This is the most important job you have, is convincing people of your value. And so just make sure you're very careful and you do some of the things I'm talking about. So the second round interview, most attorneys, again, are able to get to the second round, unless it's like a cattle call type interview, or sometimes firms will interview people and the salaries will be ridiculously low. And you'll learn that during the screening interview and be shocked and won't get the job. And that may be okay. But most attorneys are able, meaning more than 50%, to get second round interviews and don't have as much difficulty doing that. And so a lot of the things I talked about earlier, the odds are you're probably doing those quite well. And you start understanding what you need to do. There's certain things and ways to understand the second round interview and how you behave and what you do. So if you're running for political office as a Republican, you certainly wouldn't go into election or something talking about things that are important to Republicans, or not, I'm sorry, important to Democrats, to Republicans. You wouldn't say we need more social programs and we need more, higher taxes, and we need to make it. You wouldn't talk about these things because that's just, and again, I'm not saying that every Republican's like that, but Republicans and Democrats have different worldviews. And so do law firms. Big law firms have different worldviews than small law firms. Towns and law firms in big markets have different views than law firms in small markets. Law firms that do corporate law may be different than law firm. And so you have to know your audience. This is the most basic thing. Very important. So if you're running for political office as a Democrat, you just wouldn't, there's certain things you would never do that if you're running as a Republican, you wouldn't go in and say, we need to loosen EPA regulations. And no, this is not what, everyone has a certain way of looking at the world. If you say something as a Republican candidate that sounds completely, will alienate your audience, you're in trouble. Same thing as a Democrat. And so your audience is a law firm, and you have to understand what they want. They're going to want different things depending on the location of the firm and the type of firm it is, whether they're large or small. But really, if you break it down, what they really want and what you would want if you're a law firm is they need someone to make them money. So they're either hiring you to be a worker, meaning they're hiring you to work hard, to bill a lot of hours, to not question the work, to do what's expected, to be smart, or they're hiring you to be someone who brings in work and gives it to other people. Either, both things are valuable. One's rarer than the other. I mean, partner of business is rare. But if you're a worker, which is most of the people that are getting interviewed, you're expected to behave like a worker. You're expected to do things that are asked of you, to not bring your personal issues to work and demons that are going to interfere with the work that the law needs done, that the law firm needs done. That's it. I mean, it's very simple. That means you're enthusiastic about the work, that they can see you putting your head down, that they can see you doing things and not making trouble, not alienating other attorneys and associates in the firm. You're just expected to work hard and do what's asked of you, do the best you can. And that's it. That's what they want. They're not concerned about your social life, your political affiliations, they just need work done, just as you would. So just imagine you have a job in your house, hiring someone to work there and, do handyman work or something, or paint or whatever. And if they start coming in and talking about all sorts of different things and their opinions about things and needing time off and they're not liking the past, that's going to turn you off. I mean, you're not going to want to hire that person. You're going to want to hire the person that comes in and says, yeah, I'm here and I'm ready. And I love painting, or I love whatever. And that's it. And your audience for a second round interview and a first round interview only makes money when you work a lot of hours, and they lose money if you have personal issues, or you are angry at past employers and you undermine people, or if you think you're better than where you're interviewing, or if you look like if you're going to be a downer, if you get assignments and not take it seriously. Law firms are businesses, and businesses rely on your ability to work. That's what they're concerned about. Now, they want to work with people that they like and that make them feel comfortable and that respect them. But that's when it comes down to it, they just need work done. And there will always be people to do the work. Think about it. There's people, 30,000 or whatever the number is of people coming out of law school every year. There's millions of attorneys. There's, it's 1.6 million or something in the country. So there's plenty of people to do the work. And that's all they need. And so I just want to make sure you really understand this. That's all they need. See, when you go into a second round interview or a first round interview, but in your second round, you're often very excited to talk about yourself, to talk about your experience, to share with reasons that you don't like things and reasons that you like things and what your ideal job is. You have all these personal thoughts and desires, and if you can work remotely, if you can take time off, how much, all this stuff law firms do not care about. And it's not that they're horrible places, it's that they're businesses. They don't care about any of that. They're a business. They're serving either individuals or they're serving corporations. And those corporations are faceless for the most part, meaning they need the work done and they're just not interested in you. And frankly, the law firms are need the work done. They need people to do excellent work, not a lot of questions, stick around and produce results. When the economy is doing very well and interest rates are low and everybody's making a lot of money and things are going well, which frankly was recent, but not now, then people start going to interviews and can be a little bit lackadaisical and do these things and sometimes get jobs. But when the economy is not doing as well, all this stuff comes to the forefront because they need people that are committed and enthusiastic and are working hard, and they can't afford to hire people that are going to create drama or have issues or problems and that aren't going to work hard and ask about pro bono and all this stuff in your interviews. These are all no-nos. They need people that'll do the work. So you just need to put yourself in the situation of the employer. The employer needs people that will do the work. They certainly need individuals there with different outlooks and things, but its business only functions and grows when they've got people there that are doing the work and doing it well and not complaining. This is your audience. And your audience, they may like it if you're interesting. They may like it if you have outside interest, and that will help you connect with people. And as long as there are things that make you productive, they like all these things. But all this stuff is permissible as long as it doesn't interfere with the law firm's objectives, which are to make money. Now, certain law firms are better at making money than others, but to the extent that they're good at making money, they need all of this stuff done. The highest paid law firms, the ones that pay the most money and the ones that have partners that are paying the most money, are much more in tune with you having to look like someone that can really do well making the money, as opposed to firms that may not take this as seriously. Firms in big markets need people that are going to work very hard compared to a lot of smaller markets because money is more of a commodity there and more important. You just need to remember that a law firm's objectives and their mission is much greater than your own. So you need to come in as someone that's going to work very hard and look like you're going to stick around and not bring your personal stuff or your ego into these interviews. Law firms have more money and power, and they can always find someone to do your job. Always. It's not, law firms have certainly have openings from time to time that go unfilled. It's definitely true. But they typically do want people that are somewhat conformist and just as all businesses do. And the less likely you are to appear as someone that's going to bring in business and put your head down as a partner or to put your head down as a worker and get things done, the more you're going to get hired. And it's just a sad fact. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with you being an individual and having interest, but I am saying that there's a message that you need to send that will get you hired. Does that mean you can't be an individual and you can't? No, of course not. You can do whatever you want. But when you're interviewing, this is what they're looking for. Imagine you're a single woman. Hopefully this is an appropriate example, but interested in settling down, having children, and you put advertisement on a dating site. And then imagine if the men you were interviewing and first dates said that they'd never had a long-term relationship, didn't really want one, were having a difficult time holding down a full-time job, and were ambivalent about wanting children. That would not appeal to you, but that's your audience if you're dating someone like that. So do you talk about that right off the gate, or do you not talk about those things? And this is how it is with interviews. You don't have to commit to all this stuff, but if you bring up this kind of stuff early on in an interview, you're going to be in trouble. And that's the same thing. I'm not saying that exactly. I'll give you some more examples, but people do this all the time. They tell the interviewer exactly what they don't want to hear. And they don't even know where that interviewer is coming from, but they say things that they don't want to hear. This is how you don't get a second round, you don't get jobs after second round interviews, doing all this kind of stuff. It would throw you for a loop if that happened on a date, and you probably want to go out with someone again. What I'm going to talk about now are some of the red flags, which I think are very important that happen during second round interviews. Now, there's certainly a lot, but if you remember anything from this, it's that people want people that are going to work hard and do a good job. That's it. They want to, you're there to make money and everything else that goes along with it. There are certain things, but that's what everyone's goal is. So here's some red flags. People will interview and send out these red flags, and it will show immediately that they're not likely to work out, and the employers don't like it and get very sad because they don't want to find these red flags. Again, they want to hire you. And not everybody you're interviewing wants to hire you. Like an associate may feel threatened for their job if they're also at the same level and you look like a better candidate and stuff. So not everybody you interview with is going to want to hire you, but they're going to look for reasons not to hire you if you're some sort of threat. But overall, the law firm itself is going to want to hire you. So I'm going to talk to you about a few things that people do say that are very common in interviews. So I've heard people say, I like my job, but it's getting boring. So I want to see what else is out there. Boring could mean they're not getting enough assignments. It's not routine. I don't know. Or they're doing the same practice area. And then, of course, if someone hears that it's boring, they're going to ask, are they going to do the same thing with me? And in most cases, people that leave one job for that kind of reason will leave the next one as well. They'll be like, I'm only going to stick around as long as you give me interesting work. That's the idea. And then people will move. And I've seen when I talk to candidates, a lot of them will say this. I've been like, you've been at 4 firms and why did you leave? Well, it was getting boring. The next one, getting boring. And so if you say something like that, the law firm is going to send up a red flag, and they shouldn't hire you, because if it's boring, then the same thing's going to happen. You could say something like, instead of saying it's boring, you could say, this law firm primarily represents middle market companies, and I want to work on behalf of bigger companies. And that would be the similar way of saying you're bored. But that's actually means that that firm could be perfect for you. So you have to think about that. A lot of people will talk about money, and that is also a big problem. And it's a problem mainly for associates, but also many times for partners. So why is money important? Because there's always going to be people that can pay you more money. It's just how it is. If you're making a certain amount of money at one firm, you can always find a job where you're going to make more money. And therefore, you're going to be likely to leave when there's not enough money. Now, is that a bad decision you're making? No, you're certainly welcome to leave for more money, especially if it's a huge differential of more or less money more money in one direction. That's your prerogative. And I don't really have any criticisms of it. If you keep doing that, this is a lot of partners too, by the way, will move again and again to firms that give them a bigger slice of their business or pay more money. Associates will do the same thing. So I'm not necessarily being critical of that, but you do have to be concerned. If you say that in an interview, then that's going to be what the law firm is going to realize, that if we don't pay this person enough money, they're likely to leave. And so they need to think that you're there because of you're going to commit to the work and stick around. So you don't talk about money and making more money. And most law firms that you interview with, if they ask you what your salary is and you say it's 1 and they say ours is 1.5, obviously you're going to say that would be great. Same thing with bonuses. Like people will go into interviews and say they didn't get enough their bonus was low, or that just things like that. And again, that's something that's going to turn people off. So you don't talk about money in interviews. You don't ask about money in interviews. If they volunteer it, that's fine. But again, just put yourself in the standpoint of any employer. If you're saying that they don't pay enough, then they're thinking you're likely to move. Now, what's interesting is because money is so important to the calculations that people make when they're moving firms, obviously the very best firms, the ones that want the very best candidates, will have the very highest salaries because they don't even want to have to negotiate or think about that. They just know that if they pay this big salary and everyone else pays the same salary, then they don't have to worry about it. But having to worry about money is something that law firms don't like. They don't like to think that you could leave if your bonus is not high enough. They just want to believe that you're going to commit. And again, I'm not criticizing you for leaving a firm because it doesn't pay enough. But what I am criticizing you for is bringing it up in an interview. And you need to think about that, because what they're going to say is if they interview 2 similar candidates and one's talking about money and the other's not, the one that is talking about money is often going to have the hardest time getting a callback interview. And sometimes people will do this with interviews and they'll go in and they'll talk about how they're not making enough money and they won't get callbacks. And it's really because of that. Now, this is another one that's a big deal. And a lot of times this is okay to say, but in other times it's not. So sometimes people will say they're looking for a job because the law firm is having them do work in another practice area that may be related. Securities is obviously different than M&A, but that could be something that turns firms off. Firms, depending on their size, will often ask attorneys to pitch in other practice areas or sub-practice areas within a practice area if they don't have enough work. So they do not need to worry that you'll, leave if they give you another work in another practice area. And a lot of people do this. People will say, I'm very upset. I was hired to do, labor and employment defense, and they've asked me to do a couple commercial litigation cases. No firm wants a prima donna. They want to believe that you're going to show up and work hard, and if they need you to do something in another practice area, you're going to be perfectly fine with it. People that do this too, by the way, like this sort of explanation, a lot of times will be out of work for a very long time. They won't understand why, when I say this, do I not get interviews? Well, the reason you don't get offers, the reason you don't get offers when you say this is because the firms are businesses. So they know, hey, there's no securities work going on in the market right now. We're in the middle of a recession and no one is doing IPOs or private offerings. We're going to have to give this person work in another related corporate practice area. And if we hire them, we're going to be in big trouble. Or maybe there's one of their securities partners, they've got word that one of them may be leaving. So what are they going to do? So you need to be aware that anytime you say something like this, you could be disqualifying yourself from a job. What is the best way to answer a question like that if you're leaving? You would say, I do securities, I do a little bit of M&A, but I know that your firm, out of all the firms, has some of the most largest amounts of securities work. I'd really think it's great. I'm familiar with some of this work you're getting. It's obviously you're doing something right. Things along those lines without saying that. People want team players. They want to think that you're not going to be mortally offended if you get work in another practice area. They want to think that you'll do whatever it takes to make the money and follow directions. And so they don't take it for the team. And so that's what they'll do. Sometimes people go into interviews and they talk politics. They'll say a firm's too liberal or too conservative, and they'll expect the person they're talking to believe that. Now, firms are made up of people of different political persuasions. Some may be primarily conservative and primarily liberal. But if you say this to someone who's very conservative without knowing it, they're going to not like you. So people take these political parties and stuff very, very seriously. I was talking to someone, posted a meme of, what was it? Hillary Clinton or something. And even though the person was a Democrat, it offended a lot of their Democratic friends who decided they were going to unfriend the person on Facebook. People take this stuff extremely seriously. So why would you even dip your toe into anything political at all? You don't know who the person you're talking to is. And people, they're storming buildings and just deplatforming people and all sorts of things if they don't like the way they are politically. So you just need to be very careful about talking about this stuff in your resume. You just have to be very, very careful. And then also when you interview, you can't talk about politics. You have to be very careful of this because you could immediately upset people. The other thing, the reason that's bad judgment is you don't know what the client is. The client could be very conservative. And think about some of the billionaires that have lots of clients, Musk and who else, Trump and Peter Thiel and all these kind of people. They're pretty serious Republicans. And those are the clients of a lot of big firms. So you just need to, and if you go into those firms and you talk about how much you hate Republicans, they're going to wonder, is this a good person for me to hire? What do I do? And so you just need to be very careful, and vice versa with other political parties. This is another one. People talk about the morale of the firm and that people are unhappy. Usually, by the way, the people that are unhappy and talk about the low morale are the people that are bringing down the morale. And you may talk about things you don't like about the firm, whether or not they don't pay for parking or bar dues or that everyone's unhappy. If everyone's unhappy, then that means you're unhappy. And not only that, but you're going in and talking about how everything's unhappy. So you're probably going to do the same thing with your next firm as well. And they won't, and they'll find reasons to dislike you if you talk about the morale or you talk about people being dumb or something. That's not going to help. And then you may say you have low hours, and that often is not a good idea to talk about low hours. And why? Because at every firm, there are people that have a lot of work that know how to get it, and there's people that don't. So if you become a partner and you don't get work, then you're obviously not going to have any business. That's something. But even within your own firm, when you're expected to know how to get work. So you're better off saying, I have the highest hours at my firm, but you don't talk about not having a lot of hours. You talk about how well you're doing with your hours, because what happens, even at the slowest firms, there are certain attorneys that are getting most of the work because they've done a good job setting up relationships. They've done a good job building pipelines of work with people inside the firm. They're doing good work. So people are giving them repeated work, and they do very well because you need to do whatever you can to really give the impression that you're someone that's getting a lot of work. Because the way a law firm thinks about it is, if this person's getting a lot of work, they must be a good attorney. Or if this person's getting a lot of work, they must really know how to get it from partners. And if they know how to get it from partners, they're probably going to know how to get it from companies and things in the future. Don't talk about not having work. That's a huge no-no. You don't want to do that. And if you do, it's going to create problems. And the same time, in the same case too, it's also, if you talk about something like you're being given work that you think's beneath you, meaning the law firm's giving you, you're a litigator and you're doing nothing but document review and you need discovery. And so why are they doing that? Why are they giving you work as a 6-year litigator that a first-year litigator or a contractor could do? And you have to think about that. You have to talk about people want to believe that you're getting the best assignments and that your people are dying to give you work because you do such a good job. So going in and talking about the opposite it's almost like a test. If you say I don't have a lot of work, then you're showing people that in the firm that you're not getting a lot of work. And they don't like that, especially in large markets. And then what else happens to firms? So they have people, they're freezing out of the work. Sometimes they don't like them or they've made a mistake. And then often what the law firms will do, this is, I'm sure you've seen it if you're in a law firm, more than 50 attorneys in each city. If they don't have any work, if they're freezing you out of work, they'll just stop giving you work. And they'll pay you, but they don't want to get sued. And so they'll give you the impression that you're going to need to work more. And then other people will say things like that about their outside interest. Sometimes they'll say, I don't want to work as hard so I can spend more time writing a screenplay. Or they may talk about doing a lot of writing on the side, or they may talk about things that are irrelevant to the practice of law, like but things that you could theoretically make a living at, but you're not because you want to make a living. And people do this. They go into interviews with things on their resume where they're taught, and this is a huge mistake. I don't know why people do this, but they'll talk about having a business or some sort of business and the business unrelated to the practice of law. And what always happens most of the time is the people will eventually do that interest. And the law firm shouldn't be a stepping stone to doing something else, because if your interests lie elsewhere, then you're going to do that and you're a bad hire. And so this is the way partners think, is they think I've worked so hard to get my bill hours up and to make the firm successful and doing all this thing, and I scarcely have time to sleep. This is what the most successful partners in large law firms think. So if they start seeing you have all these kind of fun interests and different hobbies and things that are real that you could make a living doing, they're going to believe that you're not someone that they should hire. Just think about it from their point of view. Again, the number one rule, anytime you're questioning what to say, you should write it on a piece of paper, and every answer should be, does this help the firm make money and be successful or not? And you need to frame your answers around that. So if you do writing screenplays and you're interviewing with a entertainment law firm, that could be a good idea. But at the same time, you need to be very careful about making your outside interest too prominent. People will talk about, this is, whatever it is, they'll talk about paternity leave, they'll talk about different sorts of things, they'll ask about paternity leave. And this is just, actually doesn't happen very often, but talking about how the firm's not too progressive or is too conservative or whatever. So if you start talking about this, again, you're going to box yourself into a corner where certain people aren't going to like you. And then every time you go and do an interview, that you have a gap on your resume. And if you get to a second round interview, firms will generally ask you about that. And they're going to want to know what happened, why the gap, and you need to be prepared to give a direct answer about that. Now, I want to just give you like a little, school you on a few things I think are really important around this. And just understand that if an employer is interviewing you, that they can almost always find someone else like you. And all you're doing when you have gaps and giving bad answers is you're just saying, especially in large markets, we can find someone like you that doesn't bring this baggage. So all the things I'm talking about right now would be considered baggage. It's very difficult in the largest markets to get around this because there's so many people. A lot of this baggage is not as important when you're interviewing with places in smaller markets because they just don't have as many options. But large law firms in huge markets, I've seen people that went to Harvard or Stanford and stuff in Chicago and never got a job in even a medium-sized firm because it's so in New York because it's such a competitive market. If you talk about you've had personal problems, you've had different things, law firms are going to get a little nervous because they're obviously, if you've had personal problems, then they're going to believe that those things could come back. And who knows what happens with people with different types of personal problems, especially if you're just vague about it, then they may assume something psychiatric or I don't know, but that prison, who knows? But you have to be very careful about that. There's nothing wrong with saying one of my relatives was dying or those sorts of things, but and making people think highly of you. But you could say I had medical condition or something, but you have to be very careful about it because those things are all going to detract from your ability to get a job. If you were buying a horse, I'm just giving you an example, a racehorse, and as part of that, you had two choices, and one of the racehorses priced at the same amount had some horrible physical problem at some point, then you probably would be obviously more interested in the one that didn't. And it's like that with attorneys as well. Try to keep that stuff quiet if you have a gap. Gaps can be framed in different types of ways. It can be framed that you had to go home, you had someone sick, the firm's practice area shut down. There's all sorts of ways to frame a gap. And that's a whole separate discussion. And I've done webinars on that. But you need to be very careful about going into too much detail about these gaps and making sure that when you talk about them, that they're framed in such a way that you don't look like you could be problematical at your next employer, or people empathize with your reasons for this. And that's a big problem as well. So if you're unable to get people to empathize, then that can be a problem. A lot of people will go into interviews and they'll talk about how they want to get a few more years of experience. Now, this is not that common, but it does happen until they go in house. And that talking about having long-term goals that don't have anything to do with practicing law are a bad idea. Meaning you have to really, and I don't like calling people dumb, but you have to really think about this from the point of view of the employer that's interviewing you, because you're basically telling them that it's a job you don't want. You're going to do it till you get something else. And you're going to come there and you're not going to be committed because you're always going to be thinking about doing something else, which means you probably won't bill as many hours, which means you probably won't be as easy to work with, which all these sorts of things are going to happen. And that's not good. You don't want people to see you that way. And going back to the dating example, which I keep coming back to this just because it's so important for how people are interpreting you. But if you go out on a date with someone and you say, I'm interested in just dating regular people for the next few years, but after that, my goal is to move to another city and find someone who's extremely successful and can help support me while I'm trying to do something else. I don't know what you would say, but you get the idea. Who in the right mind is going to be interested in you? So it's the same thing with law firms. You don't talk about wanting to do something else. You need to go into that firm and make them think that's all you want to do. And you need to take any sort of signals off your resume that you want to do something else. So what are signals? Signals would be something like people do this all the time. They put things like, I was on the Health Law Society in law school. I worked in a hospital before law school. I got an A+ in health law. And then meanwhile, they're interviewing for a job as a litigator. And they've written some articles about health law. What are you doing? Do you want to be a commercial litigator and yet there's all these signals in your resume that you're interested in health law? People do this all the time. And then they wonder why they don't get first interviews or second interviews because they're obviously interested in something else. So you cannot go into an interview and look in the least bit like you're interested in something else. You have to look like this is exactly what you want to do. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly what you want to do. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to go in-house. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be a screenwriter. There's nothing wrong with ultimately wanting to move to Hawaii and practice law remotely or something. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But you cannot talk about that in an interview because all the employer is doing is they're looking for reasons to like you. And then if you're saying things that they make them not like you or have doubts, then you need to really think carefully about that. So other people will do things and they'll start negotiating an offer before they get it. So they'll start talking about moving expenses, or they'll talk about things that they need. They'll talk about, I saw one guy, this is very funny, by the way, and it's a true story. Every place he interviewed with, he told them he needed, Monday and Friday off. This was several years ago. But he was very talented. He was like an IP litigator with a really good engineering background. And he would start telling people that. And so some people were turned off by it, but his background was so exceptional that he was able to get in the door a lot of places and get hired. But the reason I'm bringing this up is it's funny, is he actually had been an engineer since he'd been right at the same company since he'd been in law school. So the reason he needed those 2 days off is because he was expected to be in the office of this giant engineering company. And this was in Silicon Valley in those days. He said he was taking his sick wife to the hospital on Mondays and Fridays, but in reality, what he was doing was working in another job. And I guess you can get away with that in some places, but wow. But talking about conditions that you need to work there, talking about certain things that are important to you at the interview stage is not what you want to do, because you're just disqualifying yourself from that. So just ask yourself, if you want to start talking about how many days a week you want to work remote, can they find someone that isn't going to have these demands? And if they can, then all you're doing is disqualifying yourself from the job. You're saying things that this is conditional, my employment is conditional about that. And that you don't know how many other people the law firm is talking to, but they do know that if you're high maintenance, you're not going to do well there. And unless your qualifications are so far off the map in terms of how great they are. But even in that case, you just need to be very careful. I was working with a candidate that was beyond exceptional. They had a PhD in electrical engineering from very good school, I think like Caltech or MIT, those kind of things, and then had gone to a really good law school. So by really good, I don't know what it was Harvard or something like that, or I don't know, Duke, a really good law school, and gotten incredible grades, and was working in a law firm, a New York law firm in Silicon Valley, and had been there for several years, and wanted to go to a firm where they didn't have to make part. They wanted to go to a firm where they could just be not partner, but where they wouldn't have to worry about making partner, and they could just be an associate indefinitely, or maybe counsel. And very interesting. So some top firms are firms like O'Melveny and Latham and Gibson. But I don't know if it was one of those firms, but these firms were saying stuff like, is this person crazy? No, we're not going to hire anyone that's going to come in not wanting to be partner. And so even though this candidate was like the white rhino of candidates, meaning the best possible qualifications imaginable, even with that, these law firms were saying, no way. So just think about that, because some of these really good firms, and I'm just using Gibson Dunn as an example, but they can hire pretty much who they want. And they don't want to bring in people that are going to water down the motivation of the people that are there. So just think about, if you were running a law firm, would you want to hire people that are going to go around talking to other people that they don't want to work as many hours? They've got this special deal that it's just better for them you do not want that kind of thing. You want to have a culture where everyone is working hard and doing their best, and where the partners are in control, because they can control whether you make partner or not. And that improves the quality of work and the hours. So just think about the dynamics of when you start saying stuff like this in a law firm. They'll say to themselves, can we do better? And of course, a firm in Silicon Valley can do better than someone that's going to the best firms. Now, that person, of course, ultimately got jobs, but they weren't at these top firms because of the things they were saying. And so you just need to think about that. Even the best candidates, if you come in to a firm and you act like you're not committed, wow, that's game over. Most firms. Now, some firms, no, it's not, but a firm is a very good firm and very well run, it's game over. And other things people do is they say that they were fired for performance reasons, but because they didn't have enough work. And again, if you say something like that, it's going to be difficult for you. And the idea, of course, is that you were not giving work because you weren't doing a good job. A lot of people will talk about the need for free time. Sometimes they'll talk about these long vacations they took, and I've heard people talk about hunting and and having a head mounted in their apartment in downtown Chicago. You have to be very careful of this kind of stuff, because saying things that could be, that would make certain people mad, you have to be very careful about it. It's not necessarily a good idea. You don't want to take sides in debates of things. You don't want to say things that will upset people and alienate them. You don't want to talk about things that there's two sides to an issue. You just need to be very careful. Now, if somebody is on one side and they tell you that they're on that side and you're on the same side, you can agree with them and tell them maybe a little bit about you, but you have to be very careful with this kind of stuff. Now, there's another thing that people do. They're asked if they have any questions. And I'm going to help you with this particular one a lot. And when they ask you if you have any questions, the right answer isn't, no, I don't have any questions, but I hope you have told you enough about what's important to me, or no, I don't have any questions. Good questions to ask when you're asked things like that. And I do have some articles that I've done about that in the past, but good questions to ask are things like, if I started here in a month from now, what would really blow you away and make me seem like the absolute best person for this job? What would I need to do? Or what kind of goals should I set? And what is important to you and other attorneys in this firm? Like questions like that show someone's a go-getter and they want to do well based on what you think, is much more important than saying, I don't have any questions. So if people ask you if you have any questions, your questions should be about, what could I do to exceed expectations? Is it work? What can I do to get more work? Would it be helpful if you're a partner, when do you need me to start generating businesses, or things I can do now? And all those sorts of questions that show you're motivated are much more important than saying, I don't have questions. Your questions should be related around, what can I do to do an incredible job? What would blow you away? What would blow other partners away? What would make me valuable? What would make me the best associate? Those sorts of questions, when you're asking them to partners, are really good, because very few people ask those. That's all you need to do if you're asked that, by the way, and you will get more jobs. People don't like it when you talk only about yourself. They don't like it when you talk about in great detail about things, unless there's some sort of connection. There's what's called the 80-20 rule. The other side should hopefully be talking, if ideally 80% of the time. Your goal is to make that person feel very good about themselves and to trust you. And when people start talking about themselves, they like themselves. And when they like themselves, then that's great. But this is not your opportunity to talk a lot about yourself. It's your opportunity to hopefully get the other person talking in a way that they're enthusiastic, not just bland questions that would be like, where do you see the corporate department in 5 years? Things that are just, you get the people talking about themselves in good ways. Now, there's books you can read about this, which would be like, I don't know, Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. There's a lot of information out there about that. But again, if you think you're doing a lot of talking and making your points, most cases, you're not. Most people, you need to look if they're interested in things you're talking about. And you can easily tell when someone's not interested, because usually you'll start talking about something and then you'll start looking away, meaning you won't make eye contact, or they'll start looking away, they won't make eye contact, or they'll look at their computer screen, or look down, or say, wait a minute and stuff. And that's not what you want. And the people you're interviewing, it's your opportunity to make them feel important, like their job's really cool, that they're interesting, like all these sorts of things. These are basics of human nature. And so you need to think this way, like, what can I do to really make this person like me? What can I do? What is important to that? You can ask questions and you can prepare questions, but asking about what would make me a great performer, what kind of things should I try to learn about, just things that show a go-getter attitude and someone that wants to do a good job. And there are all sorts of red flags, but you should really just realize what I keep saying is that when someone's interviewing you, they want to make sure, that they're not raising red flags, that they're not taking sides on issues, that they appear enthusiastic, that they appear well received at their last employer, that they have good reasons for moving, and making sure that you're doing that. Sometimes you'll come out of a second interview that went really well, and you may not feel like you did that great of a job because you may not be really enthusiastic, and because you haven't talked about yourself very much. Sometimes those are the absolute best interviews. As long as you're driving home that you want to work hard, that the job's important to you, that you're humble, that you're going to do all the things or try to do and learn and do all the things that are expected of you, you're going to do well. There is a whole kind of psychology of associates in law firms too. Then I just want to make sure that you understand this. There's a whole psychology of associates in law firms that kind of it's us against them. Like it's us, it's the associates against the partners, the workers against the owners, or the associates against the system. And these people will go on to different sites and they'll write about it and have the secret thing where they think that way. And that thought process, if you think that way, like us against we're the resistance, the law firm, we're the resistance against power, we're workers, we're trying to get as much money as possible. This is maybe a way that you can think, and you can certainly do that if you want. But a law firm is a different type of employer. It's not something where attorneys are unionized and where they're always going to be workers and they're never, you're trying out, especially as an associate, to be a partner. And that's and so people that want to be partners have to support the partnership. You can't be us against them. That's the wrong psychology, 100%. If a law firm picks up on it, you're not going to get a job. Other things that you should be doing in interviews are, and if you're a partner as well, same thing, not me against the partners, but me doing whatever it takes to support the partnership. So any interview you go on, especially in law firms, are not normal interviews. You are essentially interviewing someone that could potentially be a partner or a partner that's going to be a partner. And anything you do on those interviews, if you don't do things properly, it could hurt you. And again, you're trying to be someone's partner. You're not us against them. You're not a union. This stuff is extremely important in the job search because, again, not a normal employer. You can do that and you can be us against them if you're unionizing in some sort of company or if you're working at a place where you stand. But again, nothing could be worse than doing that. Your audience, or all the audience needs to do, is they need to have work done with as few problems as possible. So again, Army going off to war, everyone in the Army having all sorts of red flags and issues, preventing them from being a cohesive unit, everybody having individual personalities that aren't conducive to groups, and groups doing well wouldn't work. And it's the same thing in law firms. Armies are very interesting too, by the way, and I see military resumes all the time. They're very interesting. But typically, those resumes of people in the military will basically discuss how they worked with other people and went to chain of command. But anywhere in the world, if you're working in an army, there's going to be chains of command, and you're expected to do what you're told. You're not expected to question it. And this is what's necessary to run an army. You can't have an army where every single person has opinions about how things should be done and does things in a different way and talks negatively about the Army, negative about the supervisors, and negative about the objectives. And no, this is not, you need to think that way. What would you say if you were interviewing with a group of people that's like this? And I'm not telling you to do that, but you have to think about it, like what's going to be important to them. And so law firms also need to be homogenous. They need people that are going to bill hours, get things done, and not question the system. And that just means if you have all these red flags that make it look like you may not be committed, that you're too independent and stuff, they're not going to like it. And some people have more red flags than others, but one red flag that everyone has is that you're leaving another firm. So this is really the most important red flag, meaning you're leaving a law firm, hopefully you're employed, to go work in another law firm. And so what does that mean? It's essential that if this question's asked, which it isn't always asked, but usually for recruiters are usually asked this question when the law firm wants to know. So the law firm wants to know why the person is leaving, and they want to know that. So we typically try to help people frame that when they're leaving, but the law firm really wants to know that. And what they need to understand is they want to believe that if you go to a new employer, that you're going to be able to commit, and you're not going to leave that employer and will make that employer or do anything that's going to make that employer want to leave. There's a statistic that, and this is so important, but I want to really make sure you understand this because this is one of the most important things of any lateral job search when you're looking for a job. So if you are an attorney and you're working in a market like Chicago, as an example, and you're originally from Tallahassee, Florida, just as an example. And you want to relocate from Chicago to Tallahassee, Florida, and you apply to, 25 firms in Tallahassee, and you apply to 25 firms in Chicago. If you grew up in Tallahassee, Florida, and you have a family there, and you say, it's time for me to move back, I want a lower cost of living, and I want to raise my kids there, I'm from there, or I don't know, my parents are there, whatever you need to say, something like that, you are much more likely to get interviews in Tallahassee, Florida, than you are to get interviews in Chicago, because law firms have no reason in Tallahassee, Florida to question why you may be leaving. They just believe you're going home. It's not about the quality of your work. It's not about your inability to get along with people. It's not about your inability to commit. It's just that you took a job in a big city and now you're relocating to a smaller one. And so the worst thing you can do is give employers the impression that you're not going to be committed and will leave them. So if you're relocating markets within a market, meaning you're in one market and relocating to the other, that's the biggest question that they're going to have. And so you need to understand, you need to make law firms understand, like, why are you leaving? How does this benefit us that you've decided to leave? Are there any red flags of you moving? What's going on? Like, why are you leaving? Imagine if you went out on a date with someone and they talked about all these nonsensical reasons for breaking up with past partners and started bringing up all sorts of reasons that didn't make any sense. I remember once that it was very funny. I went on a date with this person and she was divorced. I'm like, why did you get divorced? And she's, oh, my ex-husband was a binge eater. And I'm like, what? And she's like, yeah, I come home and he'd eaten like 2 ice creams and Cheetos. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, you divorced because that's of course my thoughts. So, again, what if people you went out with said, I'm currently in a happy relationship, but it's getting boring. I want to see what else is out there. I like my current girlfriend, but she's not making enough money. I don't want to be someone earning more. I hate spending time with the parents. All these sorts of things would be red flags. And for some people, it wouldn't matter, but for a lot, it would. And I hate spending time with my boyfriend's parents and broke up with him because he can constantly want to spend holidays with his parents and made me go along. Again, talking about Democrats versus Republicans, or concerned that some people were saying bad things about someone. And you probably would not like someone that was doing these sorts of things and just saying things that are red flags. And, I never want to have children, or I'm incredibly passionate about green energy. All these sorts of things could potentially harm you. And I'm not ready to settle down. I have some ground rules and just different things that are going to show that you're not committed. And I use this dating analogy because it's something that you have control over, making these decisions. So if people are saying sorts of things that are turning you off, you have to put yourself in the shoes of an employer and the things that you may be saying that turn them off. And there's all sorts of concerns that you may have about an employer. It could be their reputation, it could be their clients, it could be their salary, it could be whatever. But you don't want to make that an issue when you're interviewing right away, because it can hurt you. And so you need to think about, how would you do things in an interview as well that aren't turning people off? And you need to make sure that if you're investing in someone, like an employer is going to, that investment is going to be well served, and it will frankly be worth more over time as that person learns the work and they commit more and all that sort of stuff. So just think again, would you want to go out on dates with someone and commit to someone that seems like they're not going to stick around? So the whole idea of commitment, you need to go into an interview not thinking that you're looking for reasons to work or not work there. You need to go into it acting like you're a good match and will commit. And you need to say the right things. People understand this instinctively many times when they're in dating. Someone will go out and say, oh, I really love football. That doesn't, because they know that's important to the person. Or I'd like to do this or that. And sometimes they'll do that just to make someone like them. The same thing needs to happen in your law firm interviews. You have to get the job. And that's, again, I'm not trying to tell you to do anything unethical, but what I'm telling you is you need to position yourself in that this is a competitive situation. You're competing with other people to get the same job. You want to be able to rely on people and believe that they're going to be there, that they're not going to quit, and you're going to have to hire someone else, or there are going to be problems. They need to believe that you're someone this is the right atmosphere for you. And because if you don't convince people of that, they're going to know that you're only likely to stay for a short time. And that's it. So I look at resumes all day, not all day, but every day I look at resumes, several per day. And what I see is a lot of people will move jobs every 2 years, or or every year and a half, or every 3 years, or every 4 years. And so the idea with that is at some point, people start moving and they just something built in where they can't stick around. And that can hurt the morale of the firm, and it can also hurt the productivity, because once you check out emotionally of a firm, your work quality suffers, your hours suffer, and you don't care. And law firms hate that. That's one reason I think that there's such an emphasis in large law firms on summer programs and bringing in young people and people that are enthusiastic, and then as people get more senior, and then making it harder to stay there unless you have business. And I don't know, but you need to remember in a second round interview that the most important thing is really to focus on, what do I need to say and how do I need to appear to make people like me? You have to be able to be an actor, and you have to be able to make the people feel comfortable, and you have to make them think you're going to stick around and like you have a serious interest in them and can help them, and soliciting the right types of information. You don't ask questions about what are the salaries, when can I take a vacation, what do you think about this negative news story? You ask questions that make people feel good, and you don't act like there's anything wrong with that person. You need to be able to sell yourself, or anything wrong with that firm. And so you avoid red flags altogether. And people never do this in first round interviews, but for some reason, they start doing this when there's more contact and people are spending more time with you. They start doing that, and it can really hurt your chances. So I'll just talk about a few things, and then we'll go to questions. But one of the things you also need to understand is a lunch interview. Law firm lunch opportunities are great opportunities to blow it. Not all law firms go on lunches, but a lot of them do. And oftentimes you go with associates and no partners, which is very smart. And the attorneys interviewing you lunch will often put their guard down if you're interviewing, because you think that you're interviewing people that are also associates and that are the same age, and you'll start talking about all sorts of personal things you should not. Your interviews with associates or your lunches with associates are arguably even more important than the interviews with partners, because these lunch interviews are really where they're trying to get you to lower your guard and to see what kind of person you'd like to work with. And then where they're looking for you to say things that, especially if you're competitive with them, that would undermine your candidacy so you don't get hired. Sometimes there's people that are doing these lunch interviews that really just are afraid, they don't want the law firm to hire anybody because they're threatened by it. You really want to be very careful in lunch interviews where if people you're talking with say they want to go in-house, you don't say you want to do the same. They start gossiping about their firm. You don't want to solicit more gossip. You just want to be very nice, and you don't want to talk about your political points of view. You don't want to talk about things that could make others uncomfortable. You want to be very, very careful. These lunch interviews are not like interviews with friends. These are real interviews, and there's a lot going on, because the law firm, when they do the in-office interviews, is doing so from the position of there's a lot of formality. But these lunch interviews, you need to think it's like going out with a bunch of spies, because they're going to report anything wrong about you that they possibly can on evaluation forms. And so you need to be very careful. You shouldn't say anything to raise red flags at your lunch, and you don't know what they're even looking for. So the casual atmosphere should never fool you. It's a deadly serious thing. It's deadly serious because if you order something that's like very expensive on the menu, that's serious. If people are having drinks, which doesn't happen really much anymore, but it used to, and you have more than one, that can also lead to a lot of trouble. So these interviews are very serious, and you need to be on your best behavior. You need to really be pleasant. If you're talking about personal things, they need to seem harmless and fun, but not sides of a political debate or anything. You just need to really come across as a likable person. And I can't really tell you everything there is to do this, because it's something that's unique to you. I will tell you a couple dynamics that happen at lunch interviews. If you're going out with associates that are your age or your class year that they're taking you out with, they do want people that they can be friends with, that don't seem threatening in terms of someone that's going to work really hard and work more hours and make them look bad or take away their partnership prospects. So you need to think that's important that way. If you go out with only partners, then it's the opposite. You should be talking in terms of how hard you could work and how enthusiastic you are. They'll like that. If you're going out with partners and associates, The partners are usually going to be very deferential to the partner or the associates of the partner. The partner will tend to ask the most questions, and that it's going to be more of a formal interview than even the in-office interview. So those are important as well. So why attorneys don't succeed and they do well in first round interviews and second round interviews, it's because I think in a screening interview, you have a short period of time to try out 25 minutes, 30 minutes, or maybe 2 interviews to move things to the next step. You're not taking anything for granted. You don't know if they like you yet. You don't know. You generally do not have to bring up salaries. You don't have to bring up hours. This is just a quick look-see. You're not bringing up personal stuff because there's not enough time. You're not bringing up really past employment experiences too much. Many times they won't even ask about your reason for leaving or anything. They'll interview and that's it. They're not opening up enough to take political sides or other things to make people uncomfortable. And they're also not taking it for granted that they're going to get a second round interview. They're trying much harder than they would in most than they're on. And you only have 25 minutes or so to be on, and you're able to be excited and talk about the firm. You haven't spoken about the firm, really researched the firm in a lot of detail many times yet, so you haven't formed any negative impressions. There's a story that, and I'll just bring it up real quickly, of a relative who's in the CIA. Well, it's just my dad, but it doesn't really matter. And he was talking to one of his handlers once, and he was saying some negative things about someone that he was supposed to get information from. And this was like his boss. And he said to him, "Don't think it, otherwise you'll show it." So think about that. Don't think negative thoughts about someone you're interviewing with or the firm, because if you do, they'll pick up on it. I don't know how things work. People who knows how information, and they can read your body language, they can read the questions if you're thinking negatively about them, and they'll pick up on it. So don't think it or you'll show it. You need to think positive thoughts. And then people are very good at first round interviews because they're able to frame their experience. They can't go into a lot of detail. They'll often speak positively about their past employers. They'll really try to very quickly connect with their interviewers, and they'll often dress up for their first round interviews and not let their guard down because there's not enough time. The questions are too superficial. They act like team players, and they're very careful to maintain a distance, like they're working at this firm, but that they're not working at the firm, yet they're acutely aware that outsiders are trying to get jobs there. They do all these things. They're more formal, they're enthusiastic, and it's the exact reason people are able to get second round interviews. That's why I think a lot of times people do much better. And the final one is attorneys are not rigorously, and the law firm isn't rigorously examining you at this point. They're just asking surface questions. And so people tend to do much better when things are on the surface rather than when they start probing. And there's an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal recently where employers are, and this is not in the legal space, but where they're starting to interview people like 9 or 10 times and bringing them back, because it's much easier to do well once than it is twice or 3 or 4 or 5 times. And so with the law firm, they typically do not interview people 9 times, but they're still the second round interviews. They're really trying to learn a lot. And so you need to be very careful. Honestly, I wish this was a much longer webinar. I'm going to do a lot of questions, hopefully, after this, and I'll give the conclusions. But the final point is a very important topic. And, this is something that a professor once told me that was very interesting. But in my grades don't matter. But when I was in college, I really wanted to get all A's, and it just seemed really important. And it was hard to get all A's. And back when I was in college, the average grade for my school was like a 2.3 or 2.7 or something. It was really competitive and to get good grades, and they had a low grading curve. And what this professor said was to get an exam or to write an exam that's an A or to write a paper that's an A, you really need to take a look at and start figuring out how to criticize. So you have to criticize the conclusions, you have to criticize the language, the punctuation, and you have to really figure out, and then you have to make sure that the logic works and things. And so with an A paper or an A exam, there's nothing you can write in red because everything is thought out and presented really well. Whereas you get into the B exam, you start getting into to more red space or red marks, and then the C and the D, and to the point where nothing makes sense. And so my point to you is that's how interviewing and the second round interview is. You have to get to the point where there's no fault they can really find you. And where people aren't, if you were thinking about your interview and critiquing it, where there's not a lot of opportunity to start writing comments in red and things all over what you're saying, because it needs to make sense. And this is a difference, the same thing when someone, who does well in interviews and does not. So someone who does not do well typically starts to create issues that the firm needs to think about. And they start sending out these things, and you start, instead of being this A person that you may have looked like after your screening interview, where there wasn't as much time and as much depth, you start really starting to look like more like a B or a C candidate, because you say things and do things that detract from not marking things up. It's very interesting too, by the way, when you look at a lot of the top firms, and what do I mean by the top firms? Firms that are really the best, and the top firms, those attorneys from those firms are often very boring. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just, they're just very flat, and they work hard, and they're, I don't know, but there's not a lot of things that you can criticize them other than maybe being boring, and because they're focused in one direction. There's not a lot of things that they're doing that would make people uncomfortable. They're just very, very direct. And that's, unfortunately, one of the characteristics of people that tend to do the best in interviews. So if people in your own law school that did well and got jobs with really big firms, many times they may be the people that frankly are not the most interesting, but they can, but they're not sending out these check marks and to make themselves a B candidate as opposed to an A candidate. And so be very careful about things that you say. Be very careful, understand your audience, and then not making problem, and not giving people reasons not to hire you. And then you need to understand that you're your own advocate, and you don't want to bring up and say things that are going to detract from the trier of fact, which is the employer, from not hiring you. So you wouldn't, if you were representing a murderer or something, you don't bring up negative facts about them unless you're using those to your advantage. You de-emphasize things, and you know what to talk about, and you're careful. And a true advocate is very good at making a case, but minimizing the weaknesses to the maximum extent possible. And this is what people do when they do it do poorly in a second round interview. They send out all these signals and do all these things that makes it look like they may not be the best candidate for the job, and because they raise red flags. And the results are you're getting rejections, and you're the person that, when you take a class, I just think about it this way. When you take a class, any class in law school or college or high school, you automatically start out with an A, right? So whatever you're doing makes you an A right off the bat. But it's the mistakes you make along the way that take away and make you an A minus or a B or a B plus or a C. And so you raising red flags, I call them red because they're no different than marking up a paper or an exam with red. This is what you're doing. And red flags are all over many people when they do second round interviews. I'll take a quick break just for 1 or 2 minutes. And then when I come back, this is a live webinar. So we'll should be able to get through everyone's questions today. I apologize for a little bit long. Frankly, I would like to make this webinar a lot longer because I think there's a lot to cover. But if you understand this stuff, it could change your life. And you could start getting a lot more, both first round, doing better in your first round, but also your second round interviews. And very few people, by the way, take the time to learn this stuff because most people are very defensive and they think they know it. And honestly, just being exposed to this today should help you a lot. But yeah, back in a minute or two, and then I will take questions. And just in terms of questions, if you ask questions and you've logged in your Zoom account or whatever, sometimes it shows your name in the question, but I won't show anybody's name. So you can ask confidential questions or anything that you want, and I won't. They're private. You can ask them about interviews or anything hopefully related to this, and then of course you can ask other questions as well. All right, let's start with questions. Today I'm going to do something kind of fun. I'm going to start with the questions first. Okay, so I recently had a second round interview, and now after this webinar, I feel like I would like to write a follow-up letter to clarify a few things. What did you suggest I do with that? How should I frame the clarification in this follow-up letter? I don't know that follow-up letters are really a good idea, because what you're doing is you're drawing attention to things that they might not even have paid attention to in the interview. I talked about things to do, but at the same time, I don't know that following up can clarify things. Ultimately, the die is already cast in terms of whether or not you're going to be able to get a position or not based on whatever happened in that interview. So I don't know that following up with a question addressing those weaknesses is a good idea. Typically, if you said things that may have been unhelpful, you're better off just learning from that and maybe even writing down like what I did wrong, what I would do the next time, maybe for yourself. But sending something about a second round interview and telling people that your mistakes you made and how you can clarify them isn't necessarily the best use of your time, because you may actually be drawing attention to those things. But sometimes following up and just saying, I really enjoyed talking to you and appreciate it, and I think I would really work hard, or this is exactly what I want, those sort of things. You can do that. There's a lot of pros and cons of writing thank you letters, and I have articles on BCG that are about that. Usually, not always, a thank you letter can do more harm than good. The reason simply being that when you do a thank you letter, you may say things that are wrong, you may make mistakes, people just make mistakes in them. So ultimately, I tell most people not to do thank you letters, but it can, if you think things went well, it can get people's attention, but it's not something that you need to do. And certainly following up is not a good idea. If you're going to emphasize your weaknesses, you just need to be careful. Okay, so this is another good question. I'm glad same person asked it, so I'll answer that. So in interviews, they always ask about, a lot of times people will ask you about salary. I'm going to talk about that today, and I'm going to tell you the best way to answer those questions. So the smartest thing, I've had situations, it's very sad actually. I've had situations where, and I can think of a partner I was working with recently, didn't have any business, but was making $3.5 million a year at a big firm, and which is incredible. There's not a lot of firms that can do that. And all the firms they were interviewing with, even though they were really good firms, never would have paid them anywhere near that amount. But the person really needed a job. They were essentially losing their job because the firm, wasn't willing to pay service partners that much anymore. But they were at one point. So what do you do when you're asked about salaries? You don't talk about what you're currently making. You don't talk about, how much you want to make. You basically say, I'm here for the work. I need a job. I realize that what I'm doing is I'm learning or I like this place. This is a place where I can see me having a long-term career. And frankly, I look at being an associate an associate job as a great opportunity to get paid while working. So it's not really my biggest concern. But one of the ways to really do a good job with that is just to say, I hope I get paid what other people here are getting paid. And it seems like you have really good work. And I know that if it's lower or maybe higher in one direction is not going to make a big difference after taxes are taken out. So I'm really more concerned about just making sure I'm paid the same way that other people are. So I've seen so many people go into interviews and not get jobs because they come up with these high salaries and things. Just so you understand how salaries work, and I'll go through this a little bit just to answer these questions. So your 5 and 4 firms are just large firms that work for big corporations, and their pay is always the same. They all pay their senior associates and junior associates pretty similar amounts. They're not that much different. It's because they're competing for the same talent. Your 3 firms tend to be firms that work for medium-sized businesses or maybe smaller companies, but pretty much work for companies. Their salaries are all over the map, but typically they'll be a little bit less than the firms that do nothing but represent large companies, or they're often in smaller to mid-sized markets. You'll have that and work there. And then when you start getting into 2 firms, those tend to be they could be small businesses, but more likely consumers. So you have to position things from the law firm's point of view and to understand the pressure on them of salaries, and these would almost all consumers, almost all individuals. So you have to understand things from the law firm's point of view. So when you're thinking about salaries, all you're thinking about is things from your point of view. You're thinking, I want to make a certain amount of money. This is what I think I deserve, or whatever. But unfortunately, unless it's one of these AmLaw 100 or 200 firms or a very well-regarded boutique firm, they can't afford, unless they have clients that are just sitting there willing to pay unlimited amounts of money and do lots of work, they cannot afford to pay, and these firms can't afford. These firms can afford to pay you market salaries. But as you get into smaller firms that are working for mid-sized firms or mid-sized companies, and I would just say mid-sized companies, mid-sized to smaller companies, these firms use these firms because companies use these firms because they charge less money. So an example would be if you're working in a mid-sized firm in a mid-sized market, you can't possibly expect them to pay you anywhere near or very close to what these firms that are serving the biggest companies are doing. They just don't have the money. It has nothing to do with you. They just can't afford it. So you come in at them without your salary requirements, you're certainly welcome to, but these firms are not going to be able to pay as much. So when I say what is as much, not as much mean, it could mean they pay 10% less, 20%, 30%. It's not going to be huge, but it's going to be a lot less. Even asking that question, you should know the answer going into it, that it's going to be less than this market type salaries. It's just not going to happen. And especially if you go to smaller markets, where the cost of living is lower. And then as you start getting into these smaller firms, which will maybe represent companies and small matters, but more likely they're just representing consumers. And then you get into the smallest ones that are representing individuals. Individuals do not have deep pockets to fund lots of corporate transactions or litigation and stuff. So it's going to be a lot less still. So if your goal is to work at a high paying firm, you're going to have to try to get into these top boutiques or firms that serve the largest companies. And no one can possibly afford to pay you a very high salary if it's at one of these smaller type firms. And it's just important to realize that whatever your salary requirements are, you're insane if you go into a 3 firm and try to say that your salary is a lot. You can certainly negotiate this kind of stuff after you get an offer, but you do need to be very careful when you're going in, when you're bringing up this information at the interview stage, because it more than likely can disqualify you. And people do this all the time. It's incredibly common to make mistakes in terms of talking about how much you want to make. The big takeaway I would just say is you tell the firm, I want to make as much as everyone else is making. And that's it. I don't expect to make more, but I also don't expect to make less than whatever you guys are paying. I realize that you service mainly mid-sized companies and can't afford to pay the highest salaries, so I don't think it's going to be an objective. Or I realize that you guys primarily work for individuals, so I'm well aware of what the salary constraints might be. And if you talk to them like that, they're going to be like, wow, this person understands us, and that's going to be a good answer. So just understand your audience and what they can afford. You can't be like, I don't know, asking someone walks in that's currently driving a Honda Accord and telling them they need to buy a Rolls-Royce Phantom. Obviously, that's not how you would approach that person. You would tell them that you would try to sell them something similar. So that's how you need to answer those salary questions. I'm sorry, this person just asked this question, but I'll answer it. And I'm going to get to all the questions today because I have a lot of time. Not unlimited, but hopefully I can do most of them in a second. Okay, if you had litigation with an employer in the past, how big of a red flag is that? Your past employer is privileged, besides which you may have a settlement agreement which precludes discussing of anything concerning it. How should you handle any questions that may relate to why you left the employer? That's great. No, that's a good question. How would you handle questions related to that? You have to be smart about how you answer those questions. Employers are afraid of hiring people that have had disputes with others, but it's not necessarily the end of the world. That would be like saying, if you get divorced, no one's ever going to date you again, which just isn't true. You need to just be very careful about that. The problem with these red flags, and it just happens with everyone, is even if the employer did something horrible to you, which I've heard of a lot of bad things happening like that, then regardless of your position on things, the law firm that's interviewing you may have some issues. So if you answer questions about that, then you try to find things that you can say that aren't that are close to that. So you may say, and I'm not going to advise you what to say, but you have to, there's articles and things that I've written that talk about reasons you can leave firms. Maybe if you research it, maybe they don't have anybody in that practice area. Maybe you were working with a partner, that partner left and couldn't take you with them. maybe one of your parents was sick and you need to take time off. I don't know what the reasons are, but you definitely want to be very careful about mentioning any type of lawsuit or something that you may have had. And I don't know what that would be. You may be in a situation where you find a very sympathetic ear. So maybe you had litigation because who knows, someone was chasing you around town, or I don't know. And is it something that people could identify with? I had an instance once, it was crazy, but there was a woman that was sexually harassed by a law professor at her law school and filed a lawsuit. And I don't know what happened, but all this stuff happened. And then after filing the lawsuit, it became, I don't know, it was settled and no one knew about it. And then the professor got fired from the law school for harassing her. And then when she started her new job, I mean, this is hard to believe, but it's true. She started, and the partner the professor that had sexually harassed her had been hired by the firm after getting fired from the law school, and was like right down the hall from her. And she was very upset and quit. And so she had to be able to explain what happened. And so in that particular case, explaining that actually made a lot of sense, because who wouldn't leave a job if something like that happened? And people were very sympathetic with her. But you have to understand, how does your reasons for leaving a firm, or suing an employer, is that something that people would sympathize with, or would they believe that it could happen again? There's certain people that are very litigious by nature. I've seen candidates before, it's very funny, but not funny, but where they sued an employer, but then after that, they sued another employer. And you'd have to be crazy to hire someone that's going around suing all their employers. And it was funny because I just looked it up, and then there were news articles and stuff about it. And I read a case, and there was a published opinion about it. So some people just make those mistakes. Okay, this is a good question. I had a second round interview with an IP firm for an entry-level position, and I'm significantly older, as law is my second career. Okay, that's fine. Position, how in depth should I go into technical questions? Should I get into scientific details or provide more of a summary? Yes, as a technical person that has experience in different types of technologies, and it could be physics, it could be biology or chemistry, I don't know what your expertise is. But as someone with that type of experience, and especially if you're much older and doing this as a second career and you have a lot of background in it, yes, law firms in the tech space or in the patent prosecution space do like to know about that detail, and they do like hearing about it. And it's not bragging, it's just what they do. And so how do you put that on your resume? I think there's a couple different ways of doing that. You can certainly put it under the description of what you do or what you under your previous employers and that sort of thing. Or you could just put the name of the employer and say you were an engineer or whatever it was, and then create a list of technologies or something that appends to your resume, which, especially if it's in a lot of depth, you would write everything out. And then after doing that, you would summarize it. And by summarizing it, you would just make sure you say the same thing without using as many words. And that should work. But yes, law firms are interested in previous experience that you may have had. As a patent attorney, age is not as much against you as it is in a lot of other practice areas. The reason is that patent attorneys are not expected to get on transactions and things and work about 3,000 hours a year, 2,500 hours a year. Most patent attorneys work pretty steady hours, meaning they'll work 1,800 hours a year or something, because you have to really think hard when you do this work compared to a lot of other practice areas. You're actually, as a patent attorney, you have a lot less trouble getting a position, especially an entry-level position. The other thing that's interesting about patent attorneys is a lot of large law firms do not do patent prosecution. The reason is that because the billing rates are so high that it doesn't make sense for companies to charge them. They also not do individuals that sometimes have big books of business, and there's people all over doing it. So you can it's much easier many times to get in as a patent prosecutor, as a senior attorney practice areas. Let me see here. Well, this is kind of interesting. Okay, I'm not going to copy this person's name because they put it there, but okay. I am a 65-year-old ERISA lawyer with an excellent background. I'm currently employed with the Fortune 100 Law Department. But before accepting this position, but before accepting this position, I did not get offers from dozens of second interviews with prestigious firms and large company law department. I found out through friends at these firms that the primary reason was I did not get offered was concerned about my age. So in possible future interviews, how do I alleviate or even address old age concerns, even though the firm or law department never raises this age issue during a second interview? That's a good question. There's a couple of things going on here. The first thing is, if they're bringing you in for a first round interview, they already know your age because your age should be on the resume. That's not really too much of a problem. So I don't think that's something that you need to worry about. If you are getting the interviews and there's stuff that they like on your resume, and that's not surprising to me at all. The reason that they would like you is because there's not a lot of people with the kind of experience you have. ERISA is a very technical practice area where there's not a lot of people that can do it. So you're actually in pretty good shape doing that. So what's going on when they bring it up, and they're never going to bring up your age during interviews because it's illegal. So they're not going to talk about it. A lot of big law firms too, by the way, this is something to understand. They actually have mandatory retirement for partners and others at 65, but a lot of them don't. But you wouldn't be getting interviews with these firms as second round interviews if they did have a concern with your age. My opinion is that there may be something wrong, which is things I talked about today, that may have come across in your interview. I'm going to say a couple of things that may seem a little unconventional here, and I'm definitely not trying to hurt any feelings, but about getting a position when you're older. When you get in a position when you're older, you have to think, what is the benefit to the law firm of hiring me if I'm older? Does it benefit my experience? Is it there's not a lot of people like me? And those are actually two benefits that they have. But the other benefit of hiring people that are older sometimes is that they may be more flexible. They may be willing to work harder. They may not expect as much money because they've already kind of had a full career. These are all legitimate concerns that law firms may have, and things to make yourself more attractive. Law firms like hiring people that need them, and they feel like that they have a lot more control. So just think about it from that point of view. If you go into interviews and you appear more eager, and they know that you have the experience, that you may not be as much of a threat because you'll do the work and you'll be, who knows, but you need to position yourself in that way. And I'm not telling you that you need to kowtow because you're older, but if you don't have any portable business, that means they need to plug someone in to do the work other than, that, and they can. And are they better off plugging someone in that's younger that may be able to take over those clients one day? Or is it less a threat bringing you in because maybe you're working on institutional clients? So you just have to act like you really want to work. You don't see yourself being ready to retire for at least 20 years, which is actually normal. Think about the president, 80 years old or whatever, 80, I don't know what the age of politicians. You can work a long time, but you just need to tell people that I'm not going to be ready to retire for another 20 years. I'm working harder at my age than I was working when I was half my age. And that will make people enthusiastic. If you go into interviews and you're set in your ways, that you expect this, that you're in control, as opposed to making people like you and acting that maybe your age is an advantage to them because you're willing to be more fungible and you're less likely to leave, they are likely to hire you. And I've seen this happen with tons and tons of senior attorneys. Like they're able to get jobs because they appear more eager, they appear less likely to leave, they're better off to be plugged into institutional client work. They don't have a lot of other options, so the law firm feels a sense of control. And this is an important thing, by the way, with all interviews. Law firms want to feel, as you would too, a sense of control. They want to believe that you're likely to work hard, you're likely to follow instructions, you're likely to do things. And so what makes them think that? They think that when you're relocating from a market to your home market where you're from, that helps them think that. They think that if you buy a house in your market, that you're likely to stay. They think if you are married and one of your husband or wife is at home and raising the kids, all these things give the law firm an impression that you're likely to stay. So if you're older or whatever your situation is, you need to be able to give law firms the impression that you're likely to stick around. I recently left my previous law firm due to a change in the firm's direction that no longer aligned with my career goals. Okay. How can I explain my departure during a second round interview without casting any negative shadows on my former employer? Okay, so the first thing is, this is one of the biggest rules, and I'll just bring this up. Never leave a job without a new one lined up. So it's just that kind of the idea is that when you start practicing law, you really hopefully don't ever quit, and you always have a new job lined up. The reason is because it's just much harder to get a position if you leave without a new one lined up. You need to never leave a job without a new one lined up. Regardless of what the firm is doing wrong, you just end up penalizing yourself. The reason is because that law firms have choices, and they're more likely to hire people that are employed than unemployed. So just think about it because if you're unemployed, then unemployed. So unemployed people are a risk, and unemployed risk. Unemployed are a risk, and employed are less than a risk. It's important to understand the basic rule about employability. So you're actually much better off. It's much easier to get a job if you're employed than unemployed. And just once you're a risk, then they can eliminate people that are a risk or people that are less likely to be at risk. I want to get back to your question, but I just wanted to make sure I educated everyone on this, because people quit jobs all the time without ones lined up. And it's not a good idea, because you need to realize that. The problem with quitting jobs is just because lawyers are just expected to continually work. And I don't know why that is, but there's a story of once lawyers stop practicing, they rarely go back. Once pilots stop flying, they rarely go back. And I read an article, not just about lawyers, but certain professions where when people leave, they rarely go back, whether it's being a doctor or whatever, or pilot. And they talked about, I don't know, years ago, there was this pilot that had flying from New York, New Jersey or something, and his plane failed, and he had to land on the Hudson River. And he never went back to flying because he took time off going on a speaking tour or something. I don't know what happened, but the point is, a lot of times when people leave, they don't come back, and you need to be very careful about that. But if people are asking you why you left, without casting a negative light, the best way of doing that is talking about maybe there wasn't enough work, or maybe you were on a transaction and something, I don't know, improper was happening, or you got uncomfortable. I don't know, but you have to really think about that. And it's not my role to tell you the reasons, but sometimes your career goals could be something as simple as you wanted to work on different types of matters. You wanted to work on, I don't know what it is, or a different practice area, or you're a corporate attorney and you joined to do corporate related work, and all of a sudden you're doing all litigation. That's not ideal, but that certainly could be the type of answer. I've seen people, I know one person that joined a firm in, I don't know, it was Syracuse or something, and they found out that the firm's clients were mostly adult entertainment companies. There's different reasons that you may want to leave, but you just need to be very careful in terms of how you frame that. And no one's perfect, so there's nothing wrong with having some things on your resume and stuff that aren't perfect. Typically, I'm trying to get this question here. Typically, all that means is that you need to try you just need to look at more places many times when you have those reasons, because you have to understand what is it you're offering? Are you going to do the same thing with the next employer? Have you learned your lesson and what happened? And so that's kind of how that works. Can you provide some insights into the role of preparation and excelling during second round interviews? What are some key areas that attorneys should focus on when preparing in order to prepare for the interview process and make a memorable impression? The biggest thing you can do is just figure out what your weaknesses are and identify those, and then identify your strengths. And then you try to focus on your strengths. But the biggest thing you can do in my opinion, is it's psychological in nature. And so that means getting yourself just very excited about wherever it is you're interviewing, and just getting yourself pumped up, like thinking positive sights about it, getting excited about it, and all those sorts of things. And the better off you do with that, the better off you're really going to be. So you really want to do whatever you can to really look like you're fired up, excited, likely to do a good job, and and really think positively. If you're enthusiastic and seem happy enough and enthusiastic about the law firm and really like them and able to like the people, then a lot of those mistakes and things that you may make are much less serious than they might normally be, or things that are bad in your background or you don't like in your background. My biggest thing would be that you almost want to brainwash yourself to be incredibly enthusiastic about the firm going into it. Okay, this next question this is a good question. It's kind of a fun question. Okay, how do you recommend preparing for second round interviews with a junior associate, Zoom interview with two partners? The first thing is I always recommend is to dress up. You put on a tie and that sort of thing. You also want to blur your background, so you don't want people to see your background necessarily. So you blur everything behind you, which is just a setting. The reason is someone could walk in front of the camera. Maybe you have some books up there that you don't want behind you. I don't know. Or you blur your background. You show up early. You try to smile. Try not to look nervous, and all the same things that you would do in a regular interview. So the Zoom interview is basically the firm's the same thing. The firm's concerned about making money, having people that they can plug into work, pay you, not think anything else of it, and have you do the work. Those are some of the main recommendations I would make. Other things are to really know the firm. So dropping hints I was interviewing someone the other day, and I was very impressed with this person because they were a great person, great candidate. I think it was for a recruiter role, but they had incredible academics and really good job that they were in that was related to what we do. And they showed up with doing all these things. They were dressed up and put on a tie, and women, of course, it would be a different type of dress, but they were there early. The background was blurred. They were very nice and able to get along well. They asked good questions. And then they did a few things that I thought was very interesting that's important. They started talking about podcasts that I've done, that they've listened to, and webinars and things that they watched. And I certainly don't expect people to do all that before an interview, but that really made an impression on me because that showed that the person was really into it. What do you do when you go to an interview with two partners? You maybe look up the work that they've done. If they're litigators, you talk about a case that they worked on. Maybe you find some information that's open where you could read one of their briefs or something and tell them you really liked it and what they did, and all those sorts of things that may show them that you care and that you like them are really important. So think about how can you talk about the work. If they've written articles, maybe you read their article. And very few people do this kind of stuff. If I interview 10 people, only one or two will do this kind of thing. But this is what it takes to really be able to get a job. So you need to be able to, that's one of the things I would recommend doing. I'm currently interviewing with a company that has invited me to a second round interview with a hiring manager. If I make it past the second round, I'll be interviewing with a panel consisting of potential peers and internal clients. Can you give me some tips on handling one-on-one interviews versus panel interviews? Yeah, panel interviews are interesting. The problem with panel interviews a lot of times is you'll get an understanding of where, if there's any resistance to you and when we're hiring. Every firm, not every firm, but most jobs will have people in the firm that really want to hire you. And then in some cases, there may be resistance to hiring you. So what does that mean? So if there's an opening for a corporate associate, that panel interview may involve people from litigation or a partner from litigation. And maybe that partner from litigation has wanted to hire extra people for a while, or maybe they have a dispute with someone in corporate that they don't like because they didn't get enough of the distribution they're not making as much money as they want to in that part. You don't know what's going on. So in most groups of people, there's some sort of disagreement. And you have to go into those panel interviews under the assumption that these people there's going to be people in there that are going to support you, and there's going to be people in there that may be against you, and you don't know. The person that might be against you may look, not say anything, might actually be for you, and the person that is for you, you don't know. But that's the kind of thing that often happens in panel interviews. So you need to be very careful in panel interviews. Also, the panel interviewers are showing off sometimes. So they may try to ask difficult questions to show that they're really smart or something to other interviewers. You just don't know. And so what is your response? You need to really try to make a connection with everyone on the panel. And that's hard to do. So by making a connection, it means you need to try to learn about people You need to try to learn about the firm, and you need to try to talk positively about the firm. And you need to be really put yourself in a position where the law firm likes you and where you make yourself seem very valuable and like you work very hard. That's my biggest thing about panel interviews. I think they can be a little bit scary, but if you remember, the only objective of any interview is, will you make us money? And will you make us money over the long term? That's going to help you quite a bit. So just trying to tell them the answers that make it seem you're likely to be stable, like you're likely to stick around and you're likely to do well. I talk about this in every webinar, but these are the questions that all law firms are asking. Do you do the job long term? Can you be managed? Want the job? Do we like you? I don't know, will you fit in? And I think that's so pretty much when a law firm is bringing you in, they already know in your resume whether or not you have the ability to do the job. But what they don't know is whether or not you'll stick around, that means will you do the job long term? People get into trouble with that all the time because they will say things and do things in their interviews that make it seem like they're unlikely to stick around. So you have to be careful. They'll also say things that make it look like they're difficult to manage. Sometimes they'll approach it like they don't really want the job, or they'll be less than enthusiastic. And then these sorts of things you necessarily being liked and fitting in are things you can't control. But being likable just means being positive and happy and enthusiastic. And then fitting in means that you do your best to be similar to the people in the firm in a way that you just seem like you could be a cultural fit. And cultural fits have nothing to do with race or your sexual orientation or your political party. It really has more to do with, do you see the world and the practice of law in a similar way? Some law firms may be have really good customer service. Others, it depends what fitting in there means. And so you have to try to understand that when you go in there. And the only way to do that really is to research the firm and pick up clues you may have seen in your screening interview. Okay, let's see. What are the next question? What are the best ways to respond to questions about fields in which you want to practice but don't have any experience? Asking to a recent lawyer who finished a clerkship. If you don't have any experience, there's really nothing you can say other than, I'm interested in that, I'm excited to learn, I'm a team player, I'll work on whatever you need to be, that sort of thing. So that's really, in my opinion, the best way to answer that kind of question. You don't have to, if you're finishing a clerkship, there's no reason why you should be expected to have a certain type of experience. Most people that do clerkships are going in directly into some sort of commercial litigation. If it's or if they're tax clerk or bankruptcy, they'll go into tax or bankruptcy. But you're not expected to have any type of special type of clerk experience. If you're doing a clerkship, everybody knows what clerks do. So there's nothing really that you need to worry about too much. And if they're asking about practice areas you don't understand, there's no reason you should understand them. Just expressing eagerness to work in certain types of firms and to stick around there. I mean, that you're open to learning and you're not set in your ways is really the best way to answer that. Okay, this question. Okay, when an employer says long term, what do they mean? I would like to work somewhere for about 3 years and then reevaluate. Okay, again, the whole idea of not thinking something or you'll show it is important. And what I mean by that is if you think that you would only want to work someplace 3 years, then you'll go in and you'll telegraph that by the type of answers you make and by your level of commitment. And unfortunately, you're welcome to think that way, but the people that are going to do well in any law firm are going to be the people that actually go in and have goals. And their goal is to be a partner, and it's never going to change. I knew when I was in college, there was a woman that was a girl, was about a year above me, and her goal, since she'd been in high school, was to be a federal district court judge. And she did everything she could to do that. She worked as hard as she could for her grades. She got in the best law school she could. She clerked and I think went to the Supreme. Some people they set goals. And if you have goals, you're going to do a lot better than if you don't. And so long-term means if you're an employer, you're going to want to hire someone that's likely to stick around, because if you hire people that aren't going to stick around, you're going to have to hire new people. It's going to be an inconvenience to your clients. You're going to have to, there's just a lot of problems and things that this will cause. And they'll have to train someone else. It could lower the morale of the firm when you leave or your practice group. So law firms really need to believe that you want to commit. And it's true. When they hire people, if they hire someone, when you look at a resume, someone leaves, there's certain people, like if they leave, they've been at their last job for 5 years, they'll take their next job and they may stay there 5 years. Or if they were at their last job 15 years, they'll stay at their next job 15 years. So the idea is you want to be able to work someplace long-term, and you want to and give that impression. So you need to go into interviews thinking like that. I realize how important it is to stay, to try to make things work. I understand that people often leave for dumb reasons. I don't want to do that. I want to do things work. What do people do well that stick with this and that sort of thing? I was at a firm when I was in the second firm I was at a party, and this associate was coming up and joking with a partner about that office. It was a New York office, of an LA office of a New York law firm, that they never made any partners. And the partner said, that's because nobody sticks around. And it's like that in most firms. If you stick around and you don't leave and you commit, that's pretty much what they need to see. It's often a lot more at different firms, but that's what's important. So you need to come in with that kind of attitude. Very important. And the law firms need to believe that you're like that. And how you communicate to them is up to you. But for an educated lawyer with 20 years of experience, passed the bar exam, and relocating to the U.S., okay? I've done many litigations in the past and would like to apply to a litigation associate with a law firm. Does it make sense even trying, given my associate? Yes, of course it makes sense. So anybody, by the way, can get a job. Anyone can. It's just what type of jobs are you trying to get? So you have, again, your 5 firms, 4 firms, 3 firms, 2 firms, 1 firms. In terms of leverage, these firms can hire anyone they want. Anyone, because they pay high salaries. And this is the mistake that foreign attorneys make when they come over to the US. Same here. Not so much, but still selective. But when you start talking about your more consumer-facing firms, not a lot of money, most times, not a lot of money. All these firms do litigation, but no one applies to them. I don't know why. You don't even need to apply to some of these firms you can just apply to them. So if you're a foreign, this is what I would love to give a class on, how foreign attorneys job in the US if they take the bar exam and pass. But the point here is these law firms can really hire, most foreign attorneys will apply to these big firms and not the smaller firms. And so if you are applying to the smaller firms, you can always get a job. So the idea is with a foreign attorney, though, that I just want you to make sure everyone understands is, and this is for any attorney, if you have characteristics in your background, which should be a foreign attorney, you're very senior, you have problems or things that are wrong in your background, you can always get a job. The problem that people make the problems that people cause for themselves. This is what foreign attorneys do all the time too. They apply to just the largest firms. And of course they don't get jobs because the firms are worried about them sticking around or their training or whatever. So the only way for anyone to get a job, if you can't get a job in these best firms, is to apply to the smaller firms. And so you can apply to firms that work for businesses, which are very hard to get into, or you can apply to firms that work for individuals, which are less hard to get into. So my point to you is that when you're looking for a job, you need to do the best you can to try to get into the right firms. And this is really, and you don't want to necessarily try to apply to the biggest firms. Now, you won't make as much money, but why should you? You're competing with people that, frankly, that may be more likely to stick around or whatever, or have more relevant experience. So you need to start at the bottom. And this is what a lot of people that are in this kind of your position don't do. It's crazy to me. Every year, there's all these LLM programs that people go to and where they spend $100,000 plus per year to get an LM, and then they take the bar, and then they try to get jobs in all the same firms. maybe they apply to all the big firms that do international arbitration. I don't know, but and then they don't have any success, and then they're sad and they go back to their home country. This is not something that needs to happen. The only thing you need to do is just apply to the right size firms. So you apply to smaller firms that are less selective, and of course, and you take less money, but you get a job, and you can always build yourself up. If you get a job at a one firm, you can learn skills and get jobs at a two firm later, and then maybe a three firm, and maybe even a four firm once you get business and that sort of thing. So there's nothing wrong with starting out at a small firm, and especially if you're going to get a job that way. This is the smartest thing you can possibly do. And so you need to get a job. So you can't, if you go through all the expense and time of getting a position in a large firm, or getting an OLM and taking the bar, the only thing you need to do to get a job is just go someplace that's going to pay you less money and where there's not going to get a lot of applications, and do the best you can. That's it. I mean, but so many people, I don't understand it. They take a year of their life and then, or more, and get an LM and then try to get a job in the big firms. And the big firms, of course, you're not going to get a job. It's very hard. Now, some people do. It happens all the time, but it's less frequent than a smaller firm. A smaller firm would be very easy, but no one applies to them. So that's how I would respond to that. Give me a second. This is kind of an interesting question. Yeah, so this question is, are there any unconventional approaches? Give me 1 second. Are there any unique or unconventional approaches attorneys can take during second round interviews to differentiate themselves from other candidates? Yes. So most candidates are going to go in and they won't ask this question. Most people will not ask, what would blow you away? Or you wouldn't use that. What would I need to do to look like a best associate or whatever you've ever hired in my first 90 days? Something along that line. Put yourself in the employer's shoes. They want to hire someone who's going to come out of the gate really strong. So this is the kind of question. Now, there's a bunch of, you could say, it doesn't have to be 90 days. It could be a year. Differentiate myself. What does it take what are the best qualities of people? So people, that kind of question is going to really take people off. It's really going to catch people off guard, because most people do not talk like that or think like that. They go into interviews and they think, they don't ask questions like that, and they don't put themselves in the shoes of the employer. Now, that's not the kind of question you would want to ask an associate if you're an associate, but that's the kind of question you would want to ask a partner. And then when you hear it, just say, that's great. That's exactly what I try to do. And that sort of thing. You have to put yourself in the employer and think in terms of what would they like to hear. Okay. We got that question. Building rapport with interviewers is often seen as a valuable skill. From your experience, what are some effective ways to establish connection with interviewers during second round interviews, and how can this positively impact the outcome of the interview? Okay, so rapport, I would read up on rapport, because there's a lot of ways to establish rapport. Rapport, and I'll talk a little bit about it, and I'm going to get a little off center here. Rapport, how to do it. So rapport is often established. What is it called? There's something called NLP, which is actually interesting. It's called neuro-linguistic programming. This is something that Tony Robbins and a lot of people study and really think is important. So what that means is it's pretty simple. You talk in the same tone, and same tone. You imitate, you sit the same way. You do I don't know, you get the idea. Talk in the same way, sit the same way, and you basically pace the person that's interviewing you. So what that means is, if your interviewer is talking quite loud, you would also talk quite loud. If they're talking very softly, you would talk quite softly. If they're sitting in their chair like this, you might sit the same way. Or if they're sitting, it's just, this is one of the ways that people are taught to build rapport. You can read about this. That's certainly one way to build rapport. It's actually very effective once you learn it, and pretty interesting. And it actually works. And there's lots of classes and things on it. And so it's something that you can get good at if you learn about it. But So that's NLP. But then how do you establish rapport? You try to figure out what the person's interested in or what they like, and you talk to them about those sorts of things. And that would be, you show an interest in the topics they seem interested in. You talk along the lines that they're interested in. There's so much about rapport that I could get into, but there's people that are visual, there's people that are auditory. This is kind of going off the deep end here, but I'll just do a little bit of this. Auditory, and then there's people that are kinesthetic, and I don't even know, I'm spelling that wrong, auditory. But there's people that are auditory and kinesthetic, and essentially what that means is if someone who's visual will say things like, do you see what I mean? What I mean? How does that look? How does that look? And so they'll talk in terms of seeing things. And people that are auditory will talk in terms of hearing, and then people that are kinesthetic will talk in terms of feeling. So you can pick up people pretty quickly. This is very sophisticated interview techniques. And I don't know why I'm going into such depth here, but this stuff actually works. I probably should be an entire course. But the idea is that when you're talking to someone, you'll always be able to tell very quickly. You want to match their tone of voice. You want to pace them if they move in their chair. People get very good at this. I'm not going to instruct you on how to do all this right now because it's just a lot, but these are the basics. And then so you do that in terms of the way they're sitting and pacing, but you also have to learn how to talk to people. So if people are saying, I hear what you're saying, that means they're auditory. If they're saying, I can feel what you mean, this felt bad, this felt good, that's kinesthetic. So you can usually pick up when people are doing that. And then you start even trying to pace your statements and things, saying, feel, they're kinesthetic, or I don't know, but you get the idea. So this is what very sophisticated people do. You shouldn't have to learn all this to do it. But if you're asking me how to really build rapport, this is how you would do it. So I would read about NLP. I'd read about these different types of ways of seeing things or feeling things and try to pace things that way. It works. People will like you. They won't even know why. And it's a very valuable thing. Just reading about it can be very helpful. There's books on NLP. There's probably books on talking to people that are visual and kinesthetic and so forth. Could be fun too. Let me see. It could be useful. Okay, this question about networking. Okay, I'm actually doing a course right now for law students. And in that course, we talk a lot about networking. And networking, by the way, is incredibly important. This question is, networking and building relationships are often crucial in the legal profession. How can attorneys leverage their network and connections during second round interviews to demonstrate their potential value to the firm or organization? So you need to be careful with networks during interviews. So you don't want to be seen as someone that's trying to get a job just based on their network or based on using the network and dropping names and that sort of thing. You need to be very careful with that. The reason why is because people will do things all the time. People will apply to a firm through a friend. But many times that friend is someone that could be on the way out, that's not liked, or you don't know. And so you have to be very careful with that. Many times it's not to say that it's always the case, because it's not. And then you're also asking your networking connections during second round interviews. And that may mean if you're trying to give the impression that you know someone and you can bring in business or something, you're welcome to do that. But most law firms, unless there's actual business there, aren't going to pay a lot of attention to it. But I did want to just bring up one thing about networking, and this is very important. The ABA, I think it's the ABA, has done a study, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it says something like 80% of all jobs all legal jobs are gotten through networking. Now, is that true or not? I believe it probably is. I don't know if it's entry-level jobs. I don't think it applies to that. I don't know that it applies to all law firm jobs, but that's a pretty major thing. So if you have a really good network, you can certainly put that in and use that to get a position. Very helpful, and something that you should be aware of, that a really good network can help you get a position, something that's extremely important, obviously. And the better your network, the more likely it is for you to be able to get a job through that network. Developing a network and building relationships on an ongoing basis is very important. Why do networks work for getting jobs? The reason they work is because no one trusts each other. And so if people trust you and they have a reason to trust you, right when you're walking in the door, they're much more comfortable with you. And it works. I had this experience years ago. I was part of this organization called TED. And back then there were only 1,000 members. But they opened this kind of second TED 2 up where they had another 500 members or something. But you didn't get to go to the real, maybe it was 1,000, I don't remember. You didn't go to the real TED event. You had to go to something where it was like simulcast or I don't know. But so the networking opportunities weren't as good. But I was disappointed in myself for not getting in the main one because I had a lot of success at that point as companies around Inc. 500 a couple times and done a lot of things. I don't remember what it was, but felt like I should be part of this thing. And I met someone and I don't know where I met her at some TED event, but it wasn't the main TED event. And she was from the main organization. And I spent, I don't know, a day with her or something. Just, it wasn't romantic and they were just talking to her. And she said, well, the only people to get into the real TED are you have to know people and you have to get recommended by them. And because they only admit people that they trust and all that. And that's how a lot of organizations work. At our recruiting firm, at one point in time, I looked at, and all the people that were working there were people that had been, recommended by the recruiters, by other recruiters and brought in that way because it was much easier to trust them. And so this is just how things work a lot of times. So things function based on networks. And so networks are very important and it's a skill you should learn. It's not something that you can necessarily take advantage of a second round interview or something, but the better network you build, the better off you're going to be. And you really need to take that quite seriously. It's very important. And a lot of people's regrets are often in their careers or that they didn't build better networks when they're younger. And these networks can really make a huge difference in how successful you are in the long run if you have a much better network. That is a good question. So can you provide some challenging questions that attorneys might encounter during second round interviews? And how should one approach answering them? It's a good question. I think the most challenging questions are things that are related to the things you're not supposed to touch, which are sex, religion, politics, what else? Marriage, I don't know, anything related to that. Anything that kind of is about those things is usually very challenging. And even to my astonishment, even with everything that's going on in society and how people still ask these kind of questions, and it can make people very uncomfortable when these kind of things happen and not good. What are some examples of that? Someone may have a Catholic or a Mormon school on their resume, and you start talking about Catholicism or with a person and tell them you're of that religion or whatever, and maybe they're on the outs of that religion and don't like it or have had horrible experiences with it. And you just don't know. And maybe someone that you're interviewing worked for a well-known Democratic or Republican political person. They're no longer that thing. All these sorts of questions, you have to be very careful about taking sides. Taking sides would be, what are some debates in society? They're about things like use of pronouns, just don't get involved. You have to just back off and try to not take any form of position. Because if you take a position, the person may like you, but you don't know. And maybe they'll tell someone else that has another position that won't like you. So you just need to take all of this stuff is to be very careful, and you need to avoid taking sides. And some people are very good at this, but you shouldn't smile if someone brings something up like this, or you shouldn't, race. I'm sorry, I forgot about race. Race is a big one. Taking sides on race or anything that could be divisive in society. Those same things are divisive in every employer. So you need to be very careful with that. And this is just, I mentioned this question because it's from last week. And I didn't get to it last week. So I usually will answer the next week if I don't get to a question. This said, do you think a dual degree JD MBA will be advantageous when changing fields and demanding more money? Yes, I think if you want to be a corporate attorney, and law firms love people that go get MBAs, it's one of the exceptions where you can leave the practice alone, come back. Law firms like it. It's good to get business training to be able to work with businesses. So those are very popular. Okay, I think I've answered most of all the questions. I'm going to see if there's any more. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you for the questions. Those were very helpful. And I think those will help a lot of people. Next week, I don't know what the webinar I'm going to do is, but I think one webinar I would really like to do would be talking about the pros and cons of remote versus non-remote work and how you address that, the pros and cons from an employer standpoint, and then also the pros and cons from an attorney standpoint, because I think that's another issue that people get into a lot of trouble with in interviews and also in applications, but can also be very helpful if it's done right. Thank you very much, everyone, for this webinar.